said feminism is
neutral. Here's what actually happened.
The foundation of all knowledge.
I'm really mad that
what difference does it make, right? What
Stop.
The deregulation of the industry is obviously going to cause more of that industry.
And to lubricate the trust connection between people until they have enough.
Yet we could still look at biological reality in determining who's a female, even if there are.
Why don't you denounce feminism the same way you're denouncing capitalism? If you don't...
For something to be objective, it needs to be verifiable. And you can't verify...
If I make a claim as a political pundit, it is true that I definitely could be wrong.
Yeah,
you're promoting, right?
Ideology is the main thing of politics, right? This is my ideology.
So, 2015, anyone go back and watch the footage? The first GOP debate.
Cool, Robert. Oh, dead? With a crowbar, you said?
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back yet again to the Raging Tomato. I am proud to bring forth to you the 200K marathon for Andrew Wilson with a long series of debates, a really long ass night. I need some alcohol. Please send it all now. Outside of that, we are hosting Philosophy Cat and Andrew Wilson from the Crucible. The debate topic, we're running a twofer here. Should men take care of women they are no longer in romantic relationships with? Then we are going to switch gears over to feminism is men's fault. Philosophy Cat, you have the first opening statement, if you please.
All right. Well, first of all, congratulations on the 200,000, Andrew. That's quite an achievement. Before I get started, I also would like to apologize to Andrew for our interaction back in May that led up to this debate today. After looking at some of your content in preparation for this, I found that I agreed with quite a lot of what you had to say, even if I don't always agree with the way that you approach it. So I have to withdraw my accusation of you being a shitty person. After watching the content, I found you approach your conversations in good faith, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation.
Apology
like that with
completely
you
accepted. Water under the bridge, and I'm glad that you just took a second to actually go look. But you know what? That's for me. That's enough.
Well, I'm hoping we can maybe bridge the gap of understanding between the sexes today to some degree or another. So, with that out of the way, so should men financially support women they are no longer in a relationship with? The answer to this question is not universal, but I do believe that there are many cases where it's not only reasonable, but morally right. So let me just begin by clarifying that my original statement, which sparked this online controversy that led to this debate, was interpreted by some people as a blanket claim that men should always support their exes. And that is not what I said. It's not what I meant. What I meant was that the more financially stable partner owes something to the one who made material sacrifices for the sake of the relationship, whether that's male or female, if the end of the relationship would leave one of them vulnerable. So when two people build a life together, they often make sacrifices, not just emotional, but financial, professional, social, etc. Sometimes one partner may give up on career prospects, relocate across the country. They invest their time and energy into supporting the other person's path. These are not minor things. They carry consequences. So when that relationship ends, the question is not simply, are you still obligated to help them? I think the real question is, do you just leave someone in the dust after they've built their life around you? So I'm not advocating for lifelong financial dependence, where one person is kind of providing a perpetual gravy train for their ex. I'm not suggesting that we force people to subsidize their exes in any way. But what I am saying is this. If someone made themselves vulnerable for your sake, if they followed you, they trusted you, they sacrificed for the sake of the relationship, then it's an act of decency and integrity to ensure that they land on their feet. And this doesn't mean that you owe them luxury. It doesn't mean that the support has to last forever, but it might mean helping with the transition, like covering a few months of rent, helping them relocate back home, simply making sure that they aren't thrust into poverty because of choices that the two of you made together for the relationship. So for me, this isn't so much about gender. Any obligation I would place on a man, I would also place on a woman if she were in the same position. It's more about the principle of responsibility, of knowing how to close the door on a chapter of your life without just slamming it in someone's face. And I think most of us can easily recognize the moral difference between a man who leaves like his homemaker wife of 20 years destitute and a man who breaks up with a financially independent girlfriend that he dated for 6 months. So, you know, those extremes are easy to answer. I think most people would agree that in the first case, it would be dishonorable for the man to walk away without providing support. And in the second case, it would be absolutely absurd to expect the man to fund his ex's, you know, post-breakup lifestyle. But it's those gray areas in between, right? The long-term girlfriend who gives up her job and entire social support network to relocate for a man that she thought she was going to marry, or the man who postponed his degree in order to fund his wife's degree because she was expecting, you know, they were expecting to build a future together. And I think those kinds of cases deserve more thoughtful consideration. So yes, there are cases where support is not appropriate, like when a breakup is caused by betrayal, abuse, manipulation, that kind of thing, the equation changes. But if one partner is, you know, clearly exploitative as well, continued support is maybe enabling rather than compassionate. But I'm talking about when a relationship is real, when sacrifices are mutual, and when one person would be left economically vulnerable because of those sacrifices, then I think you have a moral obligation to end the relationship in a way that sees the other person able to pick up the pieces and move on with their life. So this conversation isn't about like entitled women demanding payouts, which is what I feel a lot of people online had portrayed my position as. I don't support that. That was never my position. It's about how we leave relationships with integrity, how we close the chapter on that shared life without erasing the price that someone else paid to live it with us. And I would argue that the measure of a person is not whether they can walk away just wiping their hands clean, but whether they can do that without leaving someone else in ruin. Not because they have to, not because the law says or any entitled thing like that, but simply because it's the right and honorable thing to do.
Thank you, Philosophy Cat. And Andrew, to you.
Yeah, so Philosophy Cat starts with this isn't a universal claim. So as far as the debate prompt goes, I would say that that's just an instant default, honestly. But just to, again, be as good faith as possible, if it's not a universal claim, she claims that the devil's going to be in the details. I would actually tend to agree with this, at least to some extent, but it's in those details where I think we need to get in to what is moral and what is immoral. She says the real question is, do you leave them in the dust? Somebody made themselves vulnerable. Decency, integrity, things like this. She's trying to allude to virtues. What's the virtuous thing to do when a relationship ends? The problem is especially in modernity, I'm going to kind of lay something out why so many people, I think, gave you so much pushback on that tweet, which I thought was fair to do, though I do think it's fair you went on to clarify the tweet as well. As a person who's often taken out of context, I completely understand that sometimes you have to clarify. Though I don't think you meant the tweet as bait, it ended up kind of being bait. So I think that that ended up kind of serving in your favor in a way. What happens right now in these conditionals, the ones that you're talking about, is actually the reverse. So women are the ones who initiate most of these divorces in modernity. Do you think, Philosophat, that the women who are initiating divorces want to see a positive, more positive outcome for them or for their partner? Well, the data that I look at is demonstrating that women seem to plot this out. They plot it out sometimes as long as 2 years or longer than that, so that they end up with the house and the kids and all of this other stuff. And what gives them such an advantage in doing this is the blindsiding nature of them initiating said divorce, man isn't expecting. So you can imagine if I have all of the huge advantage of knowing that I'm going to leave you, and you don't know that I'm going to leave you, of being able to set the conditionals in such a way where it is highly advantageous to me, right? Highly advantageous to me because you're blindsided. I have a lawyer already set up. I already have everything all set up for how I'm going to essentially get what I want out of this. And so I think that that's probably why there were so many people who gave you so much pushback on that tweet, because that's how they see it. And I don't really disagree with them. I think that they are, they're basically right. When I see relationships end, it tends to be that people are trying to angle for the best outcome for themselves. Now, as to whether or not you have obligations and virtues which are set there, I do think that that is conditional, but I would immediately state that because you live in a society in which this type of immoral action can happen, where you can create these massive preparations in which to blindside your husband and then leave him kind of trying to perpetually catch up while he's playing defense, that men should be very cautious about extending too much grace to the benefit of the woman instead of himself. I don't think that in most of the cases they're getting this type of grace back. Now you could say, what about the virtuous aspects of this? Well, there's many virtuous aspects of this where I would say you have no obligation whatsoever. For instance, what about if your spouse cheats? If your spouse cheats, do you then have some sort of obligation to continue to take care of her? If she breaks kind of the vows that you put down, under which circumstances do you feel like we're getting into the nitty-gritty of these kind of underlying issues between the sexes, especially when it comes to marriage or even long-term in-house girlfriends, where the obligation begins to shift over to the man? Now, you say vulnerable position. I would also argue that men are in a vulnerable position also, that just because you're a stay-at-home wife or something like this, you as a man who are building the external factors still have a lot to risk there. So it's this kind of idea that you're being left destitute. You could be left destitute the other direction as well. So there's not a whole lot to chew on there with the position because it's conditional. So if you're just saying that it's conditional depending on each individual circumstance, I can't give you too much pushback on that because everything is conditional that way, especially when we're talking about ethics and pluralism, which I'm sure that you probably dive into. I was watching some of your videos, and it seems like you understand those concepts pretty well. So if everything is simply conditional, and we're looking at each individual condition and saying this is when it's bad and this is when it's good, maybe we can find some agreement there. But I'm not sure that that attacks the kind of main social issue which people were after with you, which was the very idea of how it is in modernity, that there's a lot of favoritism played towards women because they plot these things out, and it does not seem that men do. They seem to be the ones most often blindsided by it. So maybe we can dive into the granular details and dive into the conditions where you would actually find it acceptable to leave the spouse destitute and start from there.
Okay, and as a kind reminder to the audience, we're going to get through the debate, and then we will read and respond to your kind super chats, and we are not doing open panel for this round, so we will shut down after that, and the party will continue on. Outside of that, I leave the floor open to you.
So your question is, in what situations would I say that
because
financial support is not an obligation?
I'll restate it. So if these circumstances are conditional, every condition is going to have a different prescription that you would give. Let's start with the prescription you would give when you think it is okay to leave a woman destitute.
Well, I don't know that I would say that it's ever okay to leave someone destitute. I'm sure there are people.
Regardless of what they do?
You know, I can only speak for myself, but that's not in my nature. That's not something I would ever do to somebody. Even if they had treated me really badly, I would still, just my own sense of integrity wouldn't allow me to do that. I understand, though, that, everybody's different. Everybody processes that kind of thing different. Not everybody is such a forgiving person. And, maybe sometimes that forgiveness isn't even warranted.
Well, then I don't understand, actually. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. And by the way, if I'm cutting in too much, you can tell me. But just for the purpose of, like, moving the conversation along, I don't understand how it's not a universal claim from you then. How can it not be universal if at the same time you're saying, you would never do it? Are you just saying, I would never do it, so from my own preference, that's not okay, but it's not universal? Or what do we mean by this here?
I wouldn't say it's universal. Not everybody has the same personal equation. And the types of people I would get into relationships with are going to be different than the types of people somebody else might get into a relationship with. I don't find myself getting into relationships with people that would really ever come up. So as to like the universality of it, that was never my position to begin with. That is what everybody else who had kind of attacked me for it interpreted as, despite my repeated protestations to the contrary. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's no circumstance in which one should not just up and leave. I mean, if somebody cheats on you and betrays you, I mean, I can't really say that, oh, well, this person completely betrayed you, you need to still like support them financially. I mean, I could totally understand why somebody wouldn't want to do that.
So then,
and I don't.
So would that be okay? Would you, from your view, are you still holding your integrity, and are you still holding to your morality? If you walk in and your sister's banging your brother, and you just turn around and, I'm sorry, not your sister, your wife is banging your brother or something, and
I
you
don't
just
come
turn
from
around
that
and
kind
walk
of
out.
family.
Yeah. But you just turn around and walk out, right? You turn around and walk out, and you're like, I've had it, right? And you take all of your stuff and you leave. Is the man doing something wrong there?
No, I wouldn't say that it's wrong.
Okay.
Like, I would say he'd be well within his rights to do that.
So then actually what we have established is it's your view that for you personally, you wouldn't do it. But as far as the universal claims go, that men should never leave their women destitute, that's actually not true. There's many cases where if a man leaves his woman destitute, you would actually agree with that. Is that right?
I hate to say agree, because part of me is kind of like, there's just something about it that doesn't feel right. But
well, then is the claim universal?
Yeah, no, it's not a universal claim. It never was a universal
So then there must
claim.
there must be like some agreement there somewhere, right?
I could understand why someone would do that, and I would not really be able to condemn them for it, even though it may not be a choice that I personally would make for myself. So
then it's not immoral for them to do it, and you wouldn't actually have a well, I mean, how could you, what would the disagreement there be then? Just ick? Like, it just kind of gives you the ick? Is that the totality of the disagreement?
I wouldn't characterize it as the ick. I just don't like to see people have suffering inflicted on them. But at the same time, I'm like, well, actions have consequences. And if you want to go and like bang your husband's brother and he catches you, like, can you really blame him for just slamming the door and walking out? I like to think that people could be adult about these things and still come back and say, like, yeah, obviously we can't still be in a relationship together, but can we just be mature and amicable about the division of assets and so on and so forth?
Well, maybe we can take it one step further.
I know a lot of people can't do that.
And I'll ask you a different question. Is there instances in which leaving the woman completely destitute would likely actually be good for her?
Yeah, possibly.
So then if there's
some
cases...
people do need to hit rock bottom in order to change.
So then if we can agree that there's circumstances in which leaving them destitute would be good for them, then wouldn't the morally righteous thing to be to leave them more destitute?
Yeah, potentially, if it's getting into a scenario where your support is going to enable them.
So then it sounds like we actually have no ought for why you shouldn't leave them destitute, but we do have at least some oughts for why you should.
Fair enough.
Though if that's the case, I think you got to revamp your position and say that there's cases where men ought to leave their women destitute, which would be the inverse of what the debate prompt is, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay. Well, I will happily take that as a concession on part one, and we can move into part two if you'd like.
I mean, I don't know that I would say like he ought to do this. I don't, as a general rule, I'm not big on telling people what they should or should not do.
What do you mean?
I'm big on guiding principles. Make your decision according to those guiding principles. But when it comes to like what actions are you going to take, if somebody comes and asks me for advice, should I leave my wife destitute? I mean, well, what are the circumstances? I'm even if he lays out a really good case as to why he should leave her destitute, I would still come back and say, well, I can't really tell you what to do. You have to make that decision for yourself. I'm not going to put my stamp of approval on it, is what I'm saying, one way or the other.
Yeah, but why not? Like, if you would think that this was a good thing, it'd be the same thing. Like, I could give you examples, perhaps, of a child who is inside the house. They're a grown child, right? They're like 16, 17, and they often steal from their parents or something like this, right? Mm-hmm. By having the child there, continuing to allow them to steal, you are actually enabling that behavior, right?
Yes, you would be.
Yeah, you'd be enabling it. So I would see it as a moral ought to say, well, I think it'd probably be a good idea for you to stop allowing them at 18, 19, 20 years old when they're adults to continue to come into your home and victimize you. And it's through that exercise of boundaries that they perhaps will learn their lesson that they're not allowed to do this because of the enablement. I can make the same case on women who are promiscuous or perhaps routine cheaters, that absent the consequence of them actually having serious repercussions for the behavior, they have no incentive to change that behavior. You could even make the case with men if this is the case, right? If that's so, and I think we would have to agree that it is, how could you actually say we ought not do that in those circumstances? Because it seems to be like we ought do that in those circumstances.
In some extreme circumstances, maybe. Like if the person that's asking for some financial support is a drug addict or something, and you know that all the money you give them is just going to be poured into their drug habit, that's inevitably going to lead them down a terrible, terrible path.
So if you had a junkie wife, leave her destitute.
Yeah, like in a case like that. But again, these are extreme cases where the answers are a little bit easier, and most people's relationships are not. I think most breakups exist more in a gray area.
Look, I agree. I'm going to give you all the olive branch I possibly can. I tend to agree with you that these are more the edge cases than the commons, though I don't think that the blindsiding the men with divorce is an edge case. I think that that's actually fairly common. But leaving that aside, when it comes to the idea of I believe that men should support women they're no longer with, and then the qualifier is, well, based on conditionals. If I can give you sufficient conditionals in which it would actually behoove the woman to be left destitute, then that seems like it would cripple this entire position, because you would be saying then, no, there's circumstances where you actually ought to do that, and that is the most moral thing to do, right?
In some extreme circumstances, yes.
Yeah. So then I don't think we even need to go any further with that. The case in the proposition of should men leave their women destitute, the conclusion is to this, sometimes, right? Sometimes, at least.
Maybe sometimes, but I would say not in the majority of cases. And,
I'm actually even willing to engage with that. I'm actually even willing to engage with whether or not it should be done in the majority of cases. So if it is the case that everything is done from you through the prism of perspective ethics, or the ethical purview of, I'm guessing, what you think is what is moral or what ought be done, is that the case? There's no universals you ascribe to?
I mean, I do subscribe to certain moral universals, just not necessarily in a case like this.
Not stance-independent ones, though?
Sorry, say that again?
They're not stance-independent? Like, you're not basing them on anything other than your own personal stance?
A lot of it is based on my personal stance, sure.
Yeah. So
a lot of my position on this is based on my perspective of the world, how I would handle things, how I have handled things, the expectations I've had of partners that I've broken up with, and so forth. And I realize that most people don't engage on that level. I realize that a lot of breakups are really nasty and that a lot of people don't have the emotional maturity to split in an amicable way, even in the face of like some kind of a betrayal or something like that. So I recognize that on the one hand, the standards that I have in my own life are maybe not applicable to everybody or even reasonable for everybody. And I didn't.
Well, I'm actually willing to just engage as is with the stance, and instead of trying to beat you up on whether or not I think the meta-ethical or metaphysics or anything is consistent, that can be a very boring debate. I'm actually just kind of willing to grant the stance for the purpose of the argument. So if it is the stance that most of what you would consider an ought or things like this, or most of what you consider to be moral is not stance independent, but basically comes from you, my guess, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you're looking for kind of the best social outcomes for people, right? That's
you can put it that way.
Well, that makes sense to me, right? I think that in almost every ethical system, it's really hard to get away from the fact that we're still trying to look for good social outcomes, and all these ethical systems are driving kind of towards that in their own way, right? Would you kind of grant that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to make a different argument now based on the majority claim, the claim that the majority shouldn't. I would actually believe that socially, the outcomes for society over the long term would be better if more people left the opposition destitute and they had to deal with the consequences of the failed relationship without the aid of the state and without the aid of court enforcement, which would then provide aid. They'd actually have to work their problems out and things like this. And I actually would argue that that would probably be better for society, ultimately.
Yeah, I'd actually agree with that. I'm not a big fan of the court system. I think a lot of the pushback I got on this was from, men who kind of perceived me as advocating for, what they kind of call divorce rate or something, which isn't the case at all. Like, I'm not, I'm very anti-state in that regard. And I think if there was not the ability to just kind of take your problems before a judge and get greedy lawyers involved and everything,
you would have to actually deal with the problems, right?
Yeah.
So then now it seems like we have actually an ought against even the majoritarian claim of destitute. Like, most relationships, you shouldn't leave the other person destitute. Isn't it actually true that if in the majority of the cases people were left destitute and the aid of the state wasn't coming in to kind of push that person up, that they would actually have to deal with these problems alone without that social safety net? They would probably actually have to start working those problems out. Wouldn't that actually be a really good counterclaim against the claim of even the majority here?
I don't know that it's necessarily a counterclaim, because it kind of implies that I was suggesting that people use the state to achieve these ends, which is not a claim that I ever made.
No. Hang on. Let me qualify.
Go ahead.
I don't believe that you ever made such a claim, but I do believe that that would be an entailment of the claim. So I think that it is an entailment of the claim when you're talking about leaving them destitute and why you ought not do that. That if I'm saying, well, socially, I think that the ramifications of doing that would lead to better social outcomes, and you say, well, I tend to agree because of the court system and things like this, then that would be an entailment of that position, right?
I suppose you can characterize it that way.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that's the case, then I think I've made a really good argument for why even in the majority of cases, I wouldn't even grant that you shouldn't leave them destitute in the majority of them. So on the conditional cases, we've now agreed. And now in the majority of cases, I think we've even found some at least common ground. I know you don't fully agree, perhaps, but I think that I've made a more compelling argument here against that claim than you've made for the claim.
Well, I don't think we ever were really in strong disagreement to begin with, so much as there just being a misunderstanding and mischaracterization of my posts.
Which is fair. That's totally fair.
Like the prompt, should men take care of women they're no longer in romantic relationships with? I mean, that wasn't even a claim that I made. It was never like men specific or anything. It was just like, if you break up, try to see that your partner gets back on their feet. Don't leave them homeless. Don't force them to move back in with their parents if they gave up a job or something. There's
a lot of conditions I agree with, especially when you have kids involved. There could be concessions you need to make, which are moral on behalf of the kids, things like that. I agree that conditionally there's going to be some cases where that's the case. The crux of our disagreement comes into whether or not it is the case that you actually mean men should do that. Not really. You mean in certain cases they should, and there's others where they actually ought not. And then we moved into, but I think in the majority of cases that they probably should. And I think that we've demonstrated even in the majority of cases that probably still wouldn't actually be the better ought socially for society, at least based on your and my worldview.
I don't think that that's necessarily true in the sense, like, yes, we agree that it would be better if people just work things out on their own without the state. And, you know, that may even solve some relationship problems. But I think at the point where one person has decided to definitively leave, the question isn't so much about whether or not they work it out themselves or get the state involved. Like, what orientation are you going into this with? Are you going into this split with a hostile and combative attitude that you're trying to win and that you're trying to come out better than the other person and you want to see them crushed as much as possible because you're mad and hurt? Or can you put that aside like a grown-up and just treat the other person with respect and dignity, like regardless of how you're feeling, and just be like,
agree.
This is a fair division of assets. Given what you've sacrificed, given what I've sacrificed, how can we make this as fair as possible? Oh, you gave up a career and you've been financially dependent on me. Well, how much support do you need until you can be financially independent? Can I pay for training for you to get a job? Do you need your rent paid? Do you need help relocating?
I understand all of these conditionals are fine, but it's kind of a restatement of the argument itself, which is, sure, there's many conditionals which we would agree upon in which a man probably has some social obligation to not leave his long-term spouse who didn't do nothing, not socially destitute. But if it is the case that we're actually looking for better social outcomes and to disincentivize ultimately toxic or horrific behavior in society by allowing an enablement of court systems in the state to act as the divisionary arm which artificially supports this bad behavior, then it would seem to me that socially it would actually be a better worldview to say, no, even if you're with a rotten monster and he leaves your ass destitute, right? And that's the way it is. I think that human conditional behavior would change very rapidly in how they did mate selection and also in how quick they were to pull the trigger on getting a divorce. And so that would be kind of my compelling argument that I would make back that I think you'd have to concede is likely true.
Yeah, I don't think we're in disagreement on that.
Okay. Well, then I think we've gone as far probably with this proposition. And by the way, this is not to beat up the proposition. It's vague enough as it is. I understand that there was a lot of us talking perhaps past each other when we were on Twitter and things like that. But now it's at least clarified. So if that's the case, I'm actually happy. I wanted when I saw the second debate prompt, I was really actually very excited for it.
I thought we might need a second one because this one just seemed too narrow, and I was like, I think we're probably just going to agree on most of it.
Yeah, so I was actually really happy. I got very excited. I was like, yes. So somebody has some philosophical training.
So you're eager to move on.
Yeah, I'm actually happy to find the common ground there and move into why feminism is men's fault. If you guys are like, I'm happy to listen to the entirety of the argument. I just got my notes here, and I'd like to go through it.
Okay.
If I was going to say, if you want, we can kind of reset. If you'd like to give maybe a statement or so on that philosophy cat and kind of kick it off. You don't have to if you didn't prepare for it, but
a statement on which
like in for the feminism is men's fault.
No, I'm prepared.
Okay.
I did my homework. Do you need to read your super chats or anything like that?
No, ma'am. We will get to those later when we're all done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so men are to blame for feminism. So I'll begin by stating that I recognize that this prompt is quite provocative, but what's a good debate without spicy positions?
Those are my favorite.
Yes, it's everybody's favorite. So my position is this. Feminism is not primarily the fault of women. It is the consequence of men abandoning their spiritual center, and therefore only men can fix it. So I'm not speaking of individual blame. in this, like, I'm not pointing to the men in the audience saying, this is your fault, guys. It's not what I'm saying. I'm not excusing female responsibility for their own individual actions. What I am addressing is a metaphysical pattern. So the breakdown of cosmic order as it manifests socially. And for
do you mind clarifying just very quickly on what cosmic order means?
I will get to that. So,
okay. No problem.
I'm going to need to define some terms, I think. So I'm approaching this from a traditionalist perspective. So for anybody who's not familiar with capital T traditionalism as a school of thought, this isn't anything to do with nostalgia for the past or cultural customs or values from previous eras. That's lowercase t traditionalism. I'm referring to the primordial metaphysical worldview that has been shared across all great civilizations and spiritual traditions, that there is a metaphysical order that is prior to and superior to the material world, and that this order is the source of all true principles, values, knowledge, etc. So this is the divine cosmic order, basically. Like, think of being in alignment with this order as being in alignment with God's will, essentially. So to understand the problem of feminism, which I do believe is a big problem, we must begin not with ideology, but with ontology. So in every sacred tradition, man and woman are not merely biological categories, but metaphysical archetypes. Man corresponds to the active principle, to form, to being, the shaping, ordering, directing force. And woman corresponds to the passive principle, to matter, to becoming. She's a receptive, fertile, and dynamic substrate. And these two principles, the masculine and the feminine, this dichotomy is the root of the structure of the cosmic order. And they're not unequal, but they are distinct. So one gives the form, the other receives form and multiplies it. So the masculine is associated with stillness, essence, transcendence. In Hinduism, it's Purusha. In Taoism, it's the luminous and inward yang. In Aristotle, it's the unmoved mover. In Neoplatonism, it's the nous. It's associated with the sun, which generates its own light, and it holds an ontological preeminence over the feminine principle. Now, the feminine is the active matrix of all conditioned existence. It's the pure potency without direction, but it is capable of generation and vivification. So think Shakti in Hinduism, the yin in Taoism, the corrosive waters, the bride and the power. She's associated with the moon, which means she generates no light of her own, but can only reflect what she receives from the sun, from the masculine. So to use an analogy, think of lightning and the lightning rod. The lightning represents the feminine, right? It's powerful, it's radiant, but it's chaotic and unpredictable. And the rod represents the masculine, who draws that power down and grounds it into a usable form. So without the rod, that lightning just dances aimlessly and sometimes destructively. And with the rod, it becomes electricity. So energy gets ordered into purpose. So when we talk about the roles of masculine and feminine, we're not just talking about social constructs. We're talking about metaphysical laws. A person is physically male or female because they are masculine or feminine in an ontological sense. It's a mode of being that corresponds to a particular type of existence. You know, we can only experience existence as men or women. So when I speak of feminism, I'm not referring to political movements or cultural trends, but to a deeper disorder, a misalignment between essence and function. And so feminism arose not because women suddenly became rebellious for no reason. It arose because men abandoned their spiritual center. There is no disorder without a prior collapse of order. A society is then stable when the masculine governs, but not governing through brute force or a monopoly on violence, but through a collective grounding in that transcendent authority. And when man ceases to embody form, when he becomes passive, disordered, and oriented toward the material plane, then the feminine cannot harmonize with him. He's occupying her space. He's contributing to the chaos, and there's nobody providing a stable axis to orient around. So the feminine will then, and women specifically, will then rise to dominate him out of necessity, or they collapse in on themselves. And both of those outcomes generate this disorder. And that's what feminism is at its root. It's the feminine acting without form. It's the lightning striking and starting fires because there's no rod to direct it. So in traditional terms, this is gynocracy. This is matriarchy, women having power not because they seized it, but because men vacated it. And so feminism has emerged because men have failed in their masculine vocation. And so again, I'm not trying to pin blame on individual men, because everybody was born into an already decadent age. Everybody's been propagandized like this since birth. I don't believe most men could have stopped it. I see this path as inevitable. It's a necessary course of decline. It's just part of the structure of reality. But the reality we live with is, if men were still in touch with the transcendent masculine principle that they're meant to embody, then women would neither have yearned for feminism nor have even been capable of taking that path. And instead, we have a world where men no longer know how to lead, women no longer know how to follow, and everybody's walking blindly off a cliff. So how do we fix feminism? The solution is internal, not external. You cannot force the feminine to submit to a degraded and inferior masculine, because that would not reflect the cosmic order. It would be unsustainable. Instead, you have to reclaim the axis around which the feminine naturally orients. Feminism would dissolve in the presence of men who are authentically men, in the sense that they embody the masculine principle of form, because form is what restores order to matter, to the feminine. So in that sense, men are to blame for feminism in the abstract sense, but they also have the means to end it in the practical sense. And that's not by dragging women backwards into a past that no longer exists, or by exerting brute force, but by cultivating that inner stillness of the masculine principle and allowing women to organically reorganize themselves around it. That's how order returns, and that is how feminism is pulled out at the root.
Andrew, to you.
Yeah, so you said a lot there. I would have preferred to have stopped kind of systematically to get some better understanding, but this sounds at least somewhat Aristotelian or Neoplatonic to me. You're talking about the idea that some things are always in flux and change and other things are not. The essence of higher forms, which we're trying to link these kind of higher forms into the idea of forms that we can perceive, which are in a constant state of decay. In this case, I think that you're making the claim that our ontology of men is in a state of decay itself, because we have abandoned what it means to be ontologically men, and therefore women are attempting to fill the void by necessity. Do I kind of have that at least close?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Got it.
I think you've got the gist of it.
Yeah, the gist of it. Okay. So
if there's anything you didn't understand, we can discuss it.
Yeah, there's a bunch,
problem.
but I just want to make sure that I get the gist and steelman the argument correctly, steelman what it is that you're saying correctly, because otherwise responding to it does us no good.
Yeah.
So when you said the cosmic order, that I would like clarification on. I don't think you actually told me what the cosmic order is. What is it exactly?
So that would, to some extent, that is non-different from God. Okay. I mean, you could read things
like a higher metaphysical realm.
Yeah,
like this.
Yeah, the higher metaphysical realm, but it's like the ultimate ordering principle.
Okay, got it.
It's the law from which everything else flows. So on some plane, the cosmic law, the highest ultimate truth, like that is non-different from God. It flows from God, emanates from a place of pure being.
Okay, so the metaphysical order is a divine cosmic order?
Yeah.
Okay. When you say ontological archetypes, you're basing these archetypes on this other realm in which that archetype is in its perfect state, and then translating it onto whatever this realm is, so that we can be a reflection of that state?
So one of the key things in a key doctrine of traditionalism, and I say traditionalism, but really this is a key doctrine within pretty much all spiritual traditions that adhere to a traditionalist character. And this is the doctrine of the two natures. And that is essentially that there is a metaphysical realm of being, of spirit, which you could say like the real world, right? And then there's the lower physical realm of becoming and matter. And these are two fundamental principles. Yeah. Yes.
So you're mapping these here. So do you take the Platonic idea that these realms are separate, or the Aristotelian ideal that they're the same, and that these kind of forms of what is masculine are a reflection of what's already here, or they come from somewhere else?
Okay, so the polarity between, we could say the masculine and the feminine, being and becoming, spirit and matter, however you want to conceptualize it, it's a fundamental polarity. It is this polarity that defines the structure of all of manifestation, because manifestation arises in the contact between those two things. You cannot have any, can't have any life without them. Like it would, you just can't. You can't have something that's all matter.
So you're really talking about the noose.
Right. Think of it being like you have a dead matter and like a light of spirit comes and infuses it and now it's alive, right? Something like that. So
but this is more akin to a noose in which these things are melded together. It's not coming from here to here. They are intricately linked. You cannot have one without the other. They're reflections. The state of decay is a reflection of the state of purity of the actual form itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I got a lot of this at least. And then just to make sure I'm clear on this, men abandoned this higher form, the spiritual center. And when man ceases to embody that form, there's no more stable axis, you said. And so women, of course, will rise to fill this in, right? Okay, so I think I've gotten a lot of this clarified so that I understand it. So I would give you, this is my argument back. Just kind of granting that even all of this is true, I still actually don't think it makes sense. And here's why. You left something in there which is a key linchpin to your worldview, which I think I can falsify pretty quickly. You said force is unnecessary. Force is unnecessary. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this is, how do men abandon what makes them masculine and the part of their ontology, which is so key to their ontology, which is force itself? So, for instance, let us assume for a moment that women all collectively tomorrow go to men and demand that men let them do X thing. Let's say all of them together, united, showed up to do this. I don't know how many that would be, 3.5 billion, something like this, right? Maybe closer to 4, I don't know, but at least 3, I would say. They say, we want to do this thing. And it's this really stupid thing. I don't know what it would be.
Like feminism?
Yeah, well, I mean, even worse. Like, I don't know. They want to swim out to the middle of the ocean with logs to build a giant boat or something stupid like that. And men say, okay, go ahead, right? Are they vacating their duty? No.
I would say so, yeah.
Okay. I think that would follow, that they would be vacating their duty. How could they stop them?
Well, I know where you're going with this because I know you like your force doctrine.
No, I mean, honestly, how could they stop them?
They could stop them with force.
How else could they?
By being the kind of men where the women don't want to swim out into the middle of the ocean to get away from them.
But they're not swimming out in the middle of the ocean to get away from the men in the hypothetical. They just collectively want to do this stupid thing.
Why do they want to do this?
Why they want to do it is irrelevant. They do want to do it. And so if it's the case that they want to do this thing collectively, and it is the case that they do, and men simply allow them to, you would consider this a vacation of the ontology of men, them losing the axis of what makes them in their purest form ontologically. Okay, that follows to me. What I need from you, though, is to tell me how men, if they said no, and women said we're going to do it anyway, can stop that absent force.
The fact that the women are saying they're going to do it anyway is already indicative of the fact that the man has lost that stable center. He's no longer the point of orbit.
But how could they stop it?
They could stop it with force. I'm not saying that force is
there any other way that you could tell me that they could? What other way?
Once men have deviated away from that central axis, then all they're really left with is force. Force is kind of a degraded version of that type of masculinity. It's a sign of the degradation. So
if this is the case, if women go to men to collectively do stupid action and men allow them to, right? Women make the demand that men do allow them to. If you take away from the ontological categorization of force, thing can be done absent force. I actually don't understand how you could stop women collectively from doing fucking anything that they decided to do. Your only claim here is, well, women just wouldn't want to. Well, that's nice to say, right? However, there's all sorts of social conditionals which they could absolutely want to do all sorts of things that would be really bad for them to collectively do. And I don't actually understand how you would stop them absent the idea that men, as part of their ontological being itself, have access to force to stop them.
So, sorry, can you parse that down into a single question? I'm not sure which you want me to answer.
So if I let you do a stupid thing, you're saying that I'm abandoning my duties.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to that. I think it's important to distinguish the fact that when we're talking about the realm of the ideal, that it is an ideal. Mm-hmm. That there's no expectation that it be reflected perfectly into materiality.
Of course not. It
it's
can't.
Not possible for it.
It can't be.
Yeah, it can't be.
I get that.
There's always an imperfection in that. So, you know,
but that's actually where my problem comes in. My problem comes in with this. If somebody wants to do something stupid, right, and you let them do something stupid, when I look at what you consider the virtues of men, isn't one of these virtues of men, or the form of men, the very idea that if you want to do something stupid, thus taking the accountability and consequence for the stupid thing you do, isn't it actually better that we let you do that stupid thing? Won't you inevitably, isn't that the most masculine thing? Like, won't inevitably women come back after going and swimming out in the middle of the ocean to build their stupid boat, and they realize it doesn't work, actually have to call on men and say, we really did something really fucking stupid here? Isn't that the best way, in fact, for you to allow women in the most masculine way to accept the thing that they all seem to reject, which is accountability?
So I think it does actually matter why they want to do something like this.
Yeah, and
the
in
reason
feminism,
that it matters,
was social conditioning, right?
Sure. I'm not a pro-feminist. It's a problem. We do agree on that. The reason I think it's important to understand, like, why do they want to go and do this stupid thing? Is it just because that's their nature?
Because
some people would say it's the nature of women to go do stupid things.
I would give a descriptor I think that we can agree to. So descriptively, men are not immune from doing really stupid shit as a collective any more than women are immune from doing really stupid shit as a collective. The distinction that I would see in the whole, I think I see in your worldview, which is so obvious to me, is the difference is that you give an allowance for accountability to men, but no allowance of accountability for women. And so what you've done here is you've displaced as part of the masculine roles, the perfect form of man, that man, if they're acting in their role, right, then that's perfect. But if they're acting exit their role, there's zero accountability for women. They are doing it as a condition of men failing, right? However, if men exit out of that role, did they just decide to do that for funsies? Like, if men decided that they didn't want to be in the role of the perfect man, did they collective? Who's making that determination for them, since women can't make it for themselves?
So I think this kind of, I might be misunderstanding you here. So if I start explaining it and it's just like not really resonating with where your question is going, feel free to stop me. But when you say accountability, I assume you're kind of referring to agency.
Well, no, I guess to simplify this, it's like this. When woman steps out of her perfect form, according to your worldview, right, it's because men are not providing the access of the perfect form for them to follow. You say we should be asking the question why it is that women themselves are refusing to follow this form because men have vacated it, right? And we can see clearly that the reason is because men have exited their form. But what would be the cause of men exiting that perfect form is my question.
Okay, I understand what you're asking. So how is it that men vacate their spiritual center?
Yeah, since women only seem to be able to do this based on men doing that. Yeah, how do men do that?
Okay, so and this is why I say I can't point the finger at men and be like, it's your fault, because I do see it as a natural process. So another one of the doctrines common to traditionalist cultures and belief systems is a cyclical view of time. So it's not just point A to point B, right?
Nothing
it's
new under the sun.
Repeat of cycles. Sure. And part of that is entropy, like the decline of the golden age into the dark age.
Yeah.
And this is a natural and necessary process of the functioning of the cosmos. And so by extension, that is reflected in the quality of men. They naturally do degrade like this. They naturally decline away from that center. It's not really their fault.
That's contradicting. So what you're saying now is something totally contrary to what you were saying before.
What's the
I'll show
contradiction?
I'll show you the contradiction. You say this is men's fault because they're vacating this thing, right? And so it's a violation of their ontology. Then you go on to make a claim that due to the cyclical nature of how ontology itself works, they must vacate. So what you're actually saying is that their very being is doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is to be involved in this cycle of endless decay. So they're actually following their ontology, aren't they, by vacating it by this view?
They are abandoning it in the sense that, okay, so I kind of present to people a sort of simplified version of traditionalism just because it's too complicated to get into the multiple different stages of it. But suffice it to say, you have solar man, heroic man, right? This is the man who is occupying his center. The next level below, you have the lunar, you have the plane of woman, the plane of becoming. But below that, you have the telluric phallic man. And this is the man who has been reduced to the nature of woman because he has vacated his center. So now it kind of comes into talking about, like, are we talking about men collectively or are we talking about men individually?
Well, do you consider ontology natural?
Do you want me to answer finish answering the previous
well,
question?
I wanted the point of clarification. Is ontology natural?
What do you mean by natural in this sense?
So I guess let's see if we can pull up a philosophical definition so neither of us talk past each other. So let's see. Natural in philosophy. Let's see. A set of things which are subject to the normal workings of the laws of nature.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so then ontology would definitely be that, right?
Yeah, I think we can agree on that.
Okay, so then this is the contradiction that I would actually ask you to reconcile without giving a lengthy explanation about the tangential portions. If that is the case, and we agree that that is what ontology is, and you said that this is cyclical, then this would mean that it's actually part of men's nature to vacate the very thing that you say they shouldn't be vacating, right?
Yes, in the sense that it presents the ultimate test to masculinity. So part of the reason for the lengthy explanations is that I recognize that this paradigm is quite far outside of the typical modern paradigm, and that there's a lot of terms and concepts that are unfamiliar to people. So I'm prepared to explain all of these things, but
and I'm happy to have those explanations.
I think what you're seeing as holes are maybe just gaps in the understanding of the fuller picture. So I'm kind of trying to flesh that out for you.
I'm not sure that they are. The thing is that can you agree with me that many people, especially in the course of discourse or debate, they often use obfuscation tactics in order to go into bloviating, lengthy explanations about things which are actually tangential to the question which is being asked. Right now, we're just establishing a baseline for what ontology even is. And if ontology is natural, and if it is the case that ontology is natural by your definition, these cycles, which are also natural, or at least appealing to nature by their very nature of saying cycle, is saying that men's ontology is designed to be deteriorated. It's designed to deteriorate, right? That's what it's designed to do inside of these cycles. So I'm not sure how you could make the set piece of displacing what is ontologically a man with the idea which is ontologically man is designed to decay, and therefore this is an inevitability, and then claim that they're going outside of that ontology. That's what I need reconciled.
Okay, so are you clear on the whole the necessary entropy of materiality, that we live in a fallen age, essentially, that we cannot expect the ideal to be perfectly reflected, especially in this age.
Totally agreed. But that would also be an ontological claim. Right?
Sure.
So if these are all ontological claims, you have to remember that what you're claiming here is men are stepping out of their ontology. This is the problem with the argument. When you say men are stepping out of their ontology, it means they were not meant for this under their state of being. The contradiction is when you say that, well, part of their ontology is to step out of this through the degradation, which is part of ontology itself. That's the part that is bizarre to me, that I don't understand.
Okay. I will try to explain in a way that you do understand, and if you still don't, we will try again. Okay. So you accept the state of the entropy, the decline. So how do you get a new golden age? The Kali Yuga is what we are said to live in. It's an age when Shiva, the masculine principle, is asleep. The Shakti, the feminine, reigns. She's dancing uncontrolled. How do we get to a new golden age? Well, the doctrines generally tell us that this requires a violent reaction of the masculine principle against itself to reestablish order. And so, while it may be a natural process for men collectively to decline in this way, as it is for everything in materiality, on an individual level, men can still make the choice to reclaim that within themselves. You don't have to fix all of society. You just need to fix yourself and pull others into your orbit. Now, if men did this on a collective scale, we'd be in a much better position. We wouldn't be living in the Kali Yuga. But as a general rule,
this is circular, though. Like, so because you're making so what you're doing is you're making an ontological claim within an ontological claim. You're saying, look, the very ontology of men, the very being of men is speculated by you to be degrading in its very nature.
Well, it's not speculated by me. This is I don't claim any ownership.
Well, it is
over
for the
these
purpose
ideas.
of the debate. It's just for the purpose of the debate. I'm not saying that these are all your original ideas. I'm just saying speculated by you, at least for the purpose of the debate. Is that fair to say?
Sure.
Not that you own every idea that's ever been, before, or me, right? Many people have referenced force doctrine long before I ever got to it. Or at least, I just gave it a name and a place. But the thing is I guess what I'm alluding to is the circularity here, which is so bothersome to me, is the idea that when you talk about the degradation itself of men, you're also saying that's part of their nature, but it's also part of their nature to reject it, right? Okay, that's totally fair. It's part of their nature. They can reject it or they cannot reject it or whatever. But you're saying they're going to get there no matter what because it's part of a cycle. It's part of a cycle of what they do, right? My question.
That's not quite what I'm saying.
Well, I guess my ultimate thing that I'm leading to here, so that we can skip maybe the perception of circularity and we're not caught on this forever, is can women be responsible for men stepping out of that role?
There is a way we could make that argument in the sense that woman kind of represents the baseline in materiality. Like that is her natural domain in a way that it is not so for men. Materiality is much more suited to the nature of woman because woman is related to matter. She exists in materiality with ease. Man does not, however. Having to be in materiality is kind of like, and this is how he starts to decline away from his center because, well, now we're putting being into becoming, and the nature of that, its natural partiality is to try to enslave and subsume that principle, the masculine principle. And so man, in his illusion in materiality, he starts to prefer to indulge his senses rather than seek transcendence. He wishes that he too could exist in this sensory realm of becoming with the same ease that women do. But he can't because he's not a woman. That's not his nature fundamentally. So every moment he spends kind of bathing in these like corrosive waters, as they're called, of earthly pleasure, this does violence to his masculine center. It will not turn him into a woman biologically, but it will eventually destroy him through an ongoing dissolutive process unless he takes up
because this argument should be reversed then. The argument shouldn't be that men are responsible for feminism. It should be that women are responsible for the downfall of men.
No, I have to disagree with that.
Well, here, I'll just lay it out the best way I can. I can't give you a formal syllogism off the top of my head, but I can at least give you, I think, a pretty good argument here. The idea is that women's nature is materialistic in its own nature, and that men become envious of them being able to be part and parcel of said nature. And that is what causes them to abandon whatever their center is as men, right? Then you would be making essentially the same argument to me that I would be making back to you, which is, okay, let's just grant that this is the case. Let's just grant it, for the sake of argument. You're saying that men, if they were not devoid of this nature of what makes them man, if that didn't never happen, women would never do this to begin with. But then on the flip side, of the second end of your mouth, you say, well, it's the very material nature of women which men begin to envy and want to be a part of that causes them to abandon. Well, maybe that's not the right word, but it's the same thing I'm saying. They want that thing, right? And so because they want that thing, they're abandoning their nature because women are abandoning theirs, essentially, is what you're saying. It sounds like your argument should be in reverse here.
No, I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying.
Okay.
So it's not a matter of envy. It's just a matter that when you are submerged in the sensory world, this is what your consciousness is largely linked to, right? You experience the world through your senses. It's very easy to become attached to those sensory pleasures. Food is a big one for people. Sex, video games, sleeping too long, like things that make them materially comfortable. We are all naturally inclined to seek that, but it doesn't do violence to femininity the way it does to a man's masculinity. And so what you then have is an inversion of the hierarchy where man who should have been self-sufficient, the source of his own light, having this inner stillness, being unperturbed by the sensory realm. This is what it means to be the unmoved mover. He rests in rectitude. Things that are external to him do not pull him away from his center. But once he allows that to happen and he starts to degrade, now he becomes inferior to woman. She's just the baseline. He's now acting as a woman, but not being a woman. He's trying to exist in her world the same way that she does. It's not a matter of envy. It's just this is just natural that people would be drawn to attach and identify to the sensory realm. Does that make sense? I feel like I
think
apologize
I can
if I'm being confusing.
I actually think I can steel man what you're saying. You're saying it's a natural part of the female condition to be drawn towards a more materialistic and I would even perhaps say pampered lifestyle, whereas men. It's their role to not be drawn to those things. So if women are drawn to those things, the catastrophe on society is not nearly as brutal as the catastrophe to society if men begin to take up those ontological roles where they're focused mostly on materialism.
Right. It's kind of, woman is just being woman. She's acting according to her nature, and women's ethics are not the same as men's ethics, which I think rubs a lot of people the wrong way. But, you can't have it both ways. You can't say women should behave according to men's ethics, but then not act like men or vice versa, right?
Okay, so I'm willing to grant all of that. And now that we're clear that I've steel manned the position the correct way, it seems to me like if this is thrown out of balance too badly, right, that what confuses me is this. If men decided tomorrow to utilize force in order to correct this imbalance, what would ever be a more practical way than that?
Well, it would be practical, yes, but it is not coming from that authentic masculine center. So it becomes a LARP. And this is
this is our dispute first, is that I don't believe that violence or force is disconnected from the state of being for man. I think that you conveniently leave that out so that you can hold accountability only over men, while at the same time demanding that they not use force to realign these ontological distinctions, which is very clear to me that they could just do.
I'm not saying they should never use force or that it's not ever warranted. That's not what I'm saying.
I'm saying
relying on force when you have not redeveloped that center is inorganic. It is still in violation of a cosmic order, and feminism will rear its head again.
Well, then how are Muslims wrong? Then, I mean, how are Muslims are essentially using force to realign the very masculine center that you're demanding that men do.
They do not have a masculine center. They are very phallic men, and they use force in order to create a society to minimize their temptations to the sensory as a way to avoid having to master themselves.
You just got done saying that men at their ontological center are not supposed to be driven towards materialism. That's what leads to their downfall. And then, so we take Muslims who displace themselves from materialism on purpose, and you consider that a non-masculine trait. It makes no sense. And on top of that, you haven't actually demonstrated how.
All right, let me give you an analogy.
Hang on, let me finish. If Muslims utilize force doctrine in order to move women into compliance, and women are complying, how could they be displaced from this version of masculinity that you perceive? I don't even understand that.
Okay, so let's say, well, not let's say, because it's true. I have a chocolate addiction, okay? So if I decide chocolate's not good for me, I should stop eating chocolate, and I just stop buying it anymore, have I really conquered my habit? No, I just removed the temptation. The real test is whether somebody can put a plate of chocolate in front of me and I can just resist eating it and not be bothered by it and not be distracted by it. That's where the mastery of self comes in.
The forms, according to you, are imperfect. They're imperfect reflections. So if this is the case, then this means man's always going to be tempted, no matter what, by these various material things. How would it not be the most masculine thing under this, or at least what we can do under the decay of these forms, to displace those temptations? That not only that would go in reconcile with logic itself.
The temptation is not the same as actually mastering the temptation. And the prescription that every wisdom tradition has given for this problem is ascesis. It is self-mastery. It's an inner mastery. And in many cases, what is prescribed is not to avoid the temptation, but to deliberately arouse it within himself, deliberately stoke that heat so that it creates an even greater challenge for him to overcome. And by doing so, strengthens his masculinity the same way that steel is strengthened by
And let's
fire.
look at some of the methodologies to do that. One of the biggest methodologies used by mystics to do this is to displace people away from their temptation for elongated periods of time as they learn self-control and then place them around those temptations again to test them. So essentially, they're taking the material aspects in which they would be the most drawn to, just like you do with chocolate, displacing it from you so that you can learn to live without chocolate, and then placing the chocolate in front of you after you've learned how to not live with it for X amount of time so that you master the idea of not being dependent on chocolate. Mystics have done this for thousands of years. It's been a prescription. In ancient Stoics talked about this and how to displace.
On an individual level, you could do that.
On a macro level, they did this. On a macro level, this was done inside of these societies to displace the things which you are drawn to. So let's take Muslim society as a great example of this. If you displace alcohol, let's say, from the entirety of your society for an elongated period of time, you agree with me, the addiction to alcohol is going to drop to next to nothing. When you reintroduce alcohol to a society which knows exactly what its effects are and has learned to get by without it for, let's say, 100 years or 60 years or 70 years, don't you agree with me that those men are going to be less prone to moving towards alcoholism? That's how you learn mastery, yeah?
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Oh, okay. So you think that you learn mastery by giving heroin addicts heroin and saying good luck?
No, but I don't think a heroin addict has the right personal equation for an ascetic path in the first place.
But your entire worldview here is stating that the thing in which you, in your case, chocolate, that you're addicted to, displacing that from you is a non-assisting contribution to your mastery of not wanting to eat it. And I think that that's actually quite stupid and makes no sense at all.
If my goal was just to simply stop eating chocolate, like for health reasons or whatever, never going to happen, but let's say that was my goal.
No, it's to master you.
Then removing it would work. But if my goal is simply that I want to strengthen my own sense of self-discipline, then I wouldn't get rid of it. I would put it in front of me every day, and I would test my will.
But then
with
you
it.
would be going against the very concepts and core beliefs of the very the very priestly men and shamans that you would be referencing. I can give you 100 prescriptions right now for how it is that ancient societies took things and made them taboo or displaced them from their own societies in order to control or curb some problem which was happening, which was materially based. And then after said thing was reintroduced, they did not have the same exact problems with it, or even any of the same problems with it. Why? Because a form of mastery is understanding the pathway to victory, right? It's the same idea. If it is the case that I want to get really ripped, I'm going to come up with a game plan for how to do that over 10, 20 months, something like this. Not over 2 weeks. That would be absurd. That's going to require all sorts of new habit-changing, habit-forming things, right? Which after those are developed, you can then utilize those for whatever that mastery is. I think it's actually an absurd position to say that you cannot master these things absent displacing them. I would say that that would be the crux of your entire argument. Honestly.
Well, to take your example of Muslim society, right? So they cover up their women. They have all these sexual prohibitions. What do they do when they immigrate to the West? They form grooming gangs, and they can't control their sexual urges. They haven't mastered themselves. Removing the temptation collectively has not resulted in mastery. It's actually resulted in a weakening.
Yeah. So let's examine this, right?
Sure.
There are certain types of Muslims who form those grooming gangs. They're not the general upper Middle Eastern Muslims, are they? They're usually the South African variety. That's the truth, who form those types of gangs. So when you say, though, that when Muslims are imported here, for instance, as family units, right, they don't actually operate under those same guidelines, do they? And so this is funny how you can take this idea. I could use the same idea with Christians, right? I could say the same thing. Oh, great. If you take, kids who were raised in the Amish lands, let's say, okay, and they go on their Rumspringa. Some of them don't come back, right? Some of them don't come back. The materialism portion of it, they've adopted it, and it got them. You know what I mean? It got them. But the truth of the matter is, if we look at the social sciences, and Amish have been well studied, especially because of reproduction, we find is that this massive displacement from technology actually allows them to deal when they go on Rumspringa or when they leave finally Amish communities to deal with technology in a much better and more efficient way than the rest of us do who grew up with it. Why? Because that form of displacement actually assisted them with control. And I think that's a huge hole in your argument here.
I think you could make you could find just as many cases of people who went off the deep end once they were exposed to something that had been withheld from them.
Then give me the demonstration. Give me the demonstration of that. Because that's not the data.
Here.
Well, I'm not. I'm saying data.
Either.
I can give you the data on this. We can look at how it is that the Amish who leave Amish communities deal with technology in comparison to how the ones or how the general public does who are not raised Amish. And guess what? Yes, they deal with it way, 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 way better. The very displacement from the thing allowed them to have that sort of benefit of having control. By the way, we teach kids this. It's the same thing. If you ground your kid from their smartphone, right, you're trying to get distance between them and the smartphone so that they can start developing healthy habits for mastering whatever it is that they're doing on that smartphone that you don't like. Wouldn't you do that with your own children in order to assist them with the mastery of that? Or would you instead go, oh, here's 2 smartphones. You need to just look at them and not touch them. Like, which thing would you do to help assist them with mastery?
You know, I think a lot of it just kind of comes down to a person's natural ability for impulse control, honestly. I don't really think most modern people are very good at that. So, you know, maybe there's not a whole lot of relevance here in terms of talking about an ascetic path, because a baseline for that ascetic path is to have like control over one's mind, to have
this
that
ascetic
control
path
over the
is
impulse.
part of our very ontology, according to you. So if it's part of our very being,
it's the way to reclaim it. It's not part of your very being. It's the pathway back to.
Yes, but reclaiming your very being is part of this cycle, right? This ontological cycle. So if this is the case, then you would see that men are searching for this. Otherwise, it would be incomplete, or women would be searching for some alternative because they're incomplete. Their being's not real. Their being's incomplete. They're looking for the reconciliation for why that is, or there's that big gaping hole forever. This is the Aristotelian method here that we're pointing out. It's like if you're, as the further displaced you are from the nous, or how this metaphysical world adopts to the material world, the further displaced you are, the bigger the gap is with you. And so this is my problem here, is that here's what I see with this argument. I'll give you my broad overview. All that you're actually doing is using a bunch of pagan mysticism to try to advance the idea, and it is pagan mysticism, yes, and all you're trying to do is advance the idea that women don't have any accountability for their actions, and rather men, when they become displaced from whatever you think their ontological form of masculinity is, that's the thing which displaces women, and women themselves have no accountability. If that's the case, if women have no accountability except to that which men decide is manly, then I don't even see an argument for enslaving all women. Like, what would even be the argument there? They would be completely dependent on whatever we decide, or else they're not going to be full or whole or whatever, right?
Okay, so I'm not saying that women don't have accountability. Obviously, on an individual personal level, we all have accountability for our actions and choices. But when it comes to, agency, I mean, like, women do have that, but it's reactive. Women expand into whatever vessel men create, but they can't design the new vessel. They don't create the paradigm, they respond to it. So if you want different women, you have to be different men. There's just no other way. So
why wouldn't that would still work in reverse? If you want different men, you got to be different women. It's the same exact argument.
Because men are not embodying the passive principle.
Right. So all you're saying is that because women are the way they fucking are, you men got to change. That's your whole argument. Your whole argument, when it's reduced, is look, women's nature is that they're fucked up. And so you as men need to change so that women, right, will actually conform to whatever the changes are that you make. You're basically saying that women's entire agency, their entirety of their agency and their fullness and wholeness is based 100% dependent upon how men behave. How is that not the ultimate displacement of accountability? I have no idea, but that's exactly what it is. I would even argue some of these things which you didn't include in feminine virtue or being of woman, right? That I would say have a lot more to do with womanhood than just the idea of material pursuits, or the fact that them being in the stage of material pursuit, even if it's bad for them, is not as catastrophic as if men are. What I don't understand here, though, is how readily you're able to displace female accountability based on, well, men should just act better. That's really what you're saying. Men should just act better, and then, women will come along.
From my perspective that I'm coming from, which I think you're either deliberately mischaracterizing or you're misunderstanding something.
I don't think I am.
Whatever the case may be, I don't feel it's an accurate description of where I'm coming from. But
it has to be. The dependency, the dependency of your argument is that women are unable to change because they're fulfilling their nature. Men have to change or women cannot fulfill their nature. The core dependency of this argument depends on women, if they're in materialistic roles, not being as detrimental as if men are. That's the whole crux of it. That women being shitheads, as an is only going to change as a necessary outcome if men necessarily change. That's it. I mean, I don't know how you get around that.
So if you have wild horses that are running around, whose responsibility is it to tame them? Do you expect the horse to do it themselves? Like, just stop running, horses. Why aren't you stopping? Just stop running. That's bad. Don't do that. It's their nature to do that. The feminine relies on the masculine to give it form and to bring it into order. I'm not saying
so these bitches need to get corralled. These bitches need to get corralled. We need to go out. We need to go out and lasso these fucking bitches and put them. And you know what else we do with horses? After we lasso their asses, we put them in stables. and we give them small perimeters in which they can run. We don't want them running around doing all kinds of
Yes.
shit. You know what else we do?
Yes.
The horses vote? Fuck no. They're disenfranchised. You're actually giving an ontological status of women as being lesser than men. Fine, I can accept that.
But
then you have to
with that characterization.
Yeah.
Like I did say in my opening statement, the masculine is ontologically superior to the feminine, and that is the natural hierarchy. However, when men abdicate that role, they do move below women in that sense. So in order to reclaim that higher role that gives them that supremacy, they have to reclaim what it is that makes them masculine in the first place, reclaim that center, that inner stillness, be the axle of the wheel, and lasso the horses. That's the whole
Sounds
point.
like a lot like force.
It can be force, but force divorced
what else
from that
can it
authentic
be?
Spiritual center is just tyranny. It's power, but it's
what's
not
wrong.
authority.
What's wrong with tyranny? If tyranny, like I can point to you many
Because
societies
it
which you would
solve
consider
the spiritual problem.
Yeah, but here's the
and
thing.
This is ultimately a spiritual.
If I can
problem,
point
Andrew.
to you. If I can point to you, I agree. But if I can point to you to societies which were highly tyrannical, but the men are more reflective of this type of noose that you're presenting us, or this type of coexistence of the pure masculine form, right? Then couldn't you just make the argument that moving towards societies like that is at least that step in the right direction in order to reclaim this cycle?
No, because it's a further degradation.
Okay, well,
you do not get back. Okay. You do not get back to the center. You do not solve the spiritual crisis by going further away from it.
Let's find out if this stands up to logic. Let's find out. Is it the case then that you think that Muslim men in Muslim nations are inferior in regards to masculinity to Western men in Western nations, and tell me why?
I wouldn't say that, because I think by and large, the collective of men across the world have all degraded into this type of phallic man who is unable to exert any mastery over himself and his senses. I don't think that Western men are necessarily better or worse in that respect. I think
not better or worse.
The vices show up in different ways, but overall, you're still just dealing with men who have no self-mastery.
Okay, but that doesn't actually answer the question as to how, right? You just kind of went on this diatribe about, no, they're just equally as degraded as men of the West, but you didn't actually show me how that would be, or give me examples of how that would be, that they're just as or less or more, right? So that's a pretty bold claim to say. It's a bold claim to say, well, the Eastern nations are just as degraded in their masculinity under these kind of micro-tyrannies which you're against as Western men. Okay, I'm willing to hear your evidence for that. What is it?
I didn't bring data on that. My point is essentially that whenever you have a man who has no self-mastery over himself, he's enslaved to his senses. He is pursuing his sensory satisfactions first and foremost, instead of pursuing detachment and transcendence. Then you have a phallic man.
I've granted
and you
that.
find that all over the world.
Yeah,
so
I've
I don't
granted
understand
that,
where our
but
disagreement is.
Here's our disagreement. Our disagreement was here. When I said, how is it that the use of force in order to gain compliance is a less masculine thing? You said, because all it does is revolve in tyranny. Say, okay, if this is the case, and that is not a masculine form, the tyrannies that you would point out, which are in Muslim nations, can you explain to me how those are more, less, or equal in masculinity to the men in Western nations? Using any I want any examples you have would be fine.
I don't understand why you're bringing in this question of tyranny in the Muslim nations. Link this up for me. Where are we going?
Yeah,
with
so
this?
because I asked you a specific question. My question to you was, in regards to men using collective force like Muslims do in order to gain compliance of women, right? Wouldn't that be leading them back towards this masculine form, which you say that they should have? Your answer, no. All that would do is lead to a tyranny. Okay, well, that actually makes sense to me. That's a consistent position. I'm just asking for the demonstration that that position is true by you showing me how they're either equally as degraded the men of the West as you claimed, or less or more so. That's it.
Do you see these tyrannies as being reflective of patriarchy? Is that the point that you're making with this?
No, I'll go through it again. So if the claim is...
You don't need to go through it again.
Yeah, right.
I'm just
I
wondering
think
why
I do.
we're stuck on this.
Yeah, because it's a very important point to your archetype, which you're presenting here. The presentation of the archetype, when I say why is it then, if we wanted to master the archetype of what you consider masculinity to be, we could not simply enforce our will using force as a movement towards that from this state of decay.
Why can't you use tyranny to get back to?
Yes, your
answer. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, and your answer was your answer was not to do that, because that just leads to tyranny, which is not moving you back to this perfect masculine form. I can concede that that's consistent, but I would at least want examples of how these tyrannies show less masculine men or equally less masculine men to that of the West, and so far I have no answer at all.
Do you understand the difference between like genuine like auctoritas that's rooted in being and has spiritual legitimacy versus a power that's just purely material and coercive, like a might makes right type of thing? Do you see a difference between those two things at all?
Sure, but do you understand that if you make the claim that these things are counterintuitive to the masculinity of men, then you should be able to demonstrate that with examples of how, and thus far you have not.
Because the tyranny that we're seeing I mean, I don't really necessarily want to call Muslim governments like tyrannical or anything, because I find that that's just kind of a word used by Western democracies to smear other countries.
Okay, well, they're highly theocratic. They're highly theocratic and what you would consider by every Western metric oppressive towards women. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So I think most people would at least place that in some kind of category of perhaps tyranny or something akin to that. While I'm not going to force you to become hyper-specific, we would say that they're at least really, really, really different and more authoritarian. So if that's the case...
I don't have a problem with authoritarianism necessarily. I don't have a problem with a theocratic government. I don't have a problem with a patriarchy. I would like to see a genuine patriarchy return, but a tyranny that is based purely in force with no spiritual legitimacy is not a true patriarchy.
Then you should be able to show that the men inside of the society are equally less masculine than Western men, or that they have some type of equal par with masculinity. And if you could demonstrate that, I think that we would be able to get somewhere here.
Okay, what would you like to demonstrate that? You want me to go search stuff up right now? Pause the debate?
Yeah, just what makes them less. I'm just asking you for. You can even give me anecdotal examples of how these men are less masculine or equally less masculine to men of the West. I'm even willing to just have anecdotes here, just fucking anything that would demonstrate the point or give me some credit to your point that the leading of this empty tyranny, as you call it, would not lead back towards your idea of perfect masculinity, or at least come akin to it, from them controlling women with force.
I can understand why you would maybe think that men in Muslim countries or other nations. I mean, you maybe even could make the case that Western men are probably even a bit more degraded, just from the sheer perspective that men in the West are, by and large, less religious. I don't necessarily equate the religious with a spiritual center, but it does help for sure.
Yeah, but do you see how
you could?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I was just.
If you keep interrupting me, I'm going to keep losing my train of thought.
I just apologize when you have me too. When you have, and I already did a debate today. But the thing is like when you have an elongated pause, I think you're done. That's why. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I'm thinking of how to word things. I'm not the best at speaking off the top of my head. I prefer to write. But anyway, sorry. Where did we leave off?
Yeah, we were discussing the examples that you were going to give me, which would show that this empty tyranny, it has less to do with us moving these societies through strict, forceful control of women towards the perfect ideal of masculinity.
All right. Well, let me give you an example, I guess. So when we're talking about the type of man who is more masculine, has his spiritual center, I don't think he needs to use force on a woman because she organically wants to please. So when you have a situation where you have to use widespread oppression of women to keep them in line, it's a sign that that masculine center has been abdicated. So let me ask you this, Andrew. How many men like what I have described have you ever loved? I'm hoping the answer is probably zero, but.
Hang on, that you have described?
The type of ideal man, the one who is self-sufficient, has the inner stillness, he's spiritually grounded, he has that masculine center. Have you ever even
I
met
would give these attributes probably to a couple of priests that I've met, maybe.
Sure.
And then one who would be the closest to that, though not a perfect embodiment, would be my own father. But yeah, not a perfect embodiment of it, no.
That's nice that you had a dad like that.
Isn't it, though?
So it's great that you think of him like that. But I will say,
I do think of him like that.
As a woman myself, I like, it's not my intention to bring this into personal anecdote or anything, but just by way of example, as a woman myself who has loved such a man, I can say it really does radically change you on a fundamental level.
Okay. But this
So
do you understand, though?
There is no need for there to be force used when there is that mutual love and respect and admiration. There is a natural submission to that masculine principle. Force isn't necessary.
Yeah,
and that's why I say the use of force starts to show as a symptom of the degradation.
Then why can't you give us a demonstration of how that's true? Because we right now have parallel societies we can make a comparison contrast to. One society. Hang on. Let me finish.
I had limited time to put stuff together,
let me
and I
finish.
didn't know what you were going to bring up.
But let me
If you
finish.
had told me in advance, I would have done that.
Okay, but let me finish. Okay, we have parallel worlds which exist right now, and how men act in these parallel worlds. Eastern Europe doesn't act like Western Europe, okay, at all, not even a little bit. And the Muslim nations and the Oriental nations, the Chinese, Japanese, this type of thing. They don't act like we do in the West either, okay? But, however, there's a lot more strict force which is used to govern women. If your case was true that these things did not lead naturally, controlling women through use of force towards that more or greater ideal of masculinity, I would expect to see these societies degradate. In other words, the masculinity portions of these societies should be degraded in comparison to where women are not controlled. And I see the opposite. You make the claim, no, they're both equally degraded, but have no examples for me, and that's what's so bothersome to me. Because it sounds.
I would say on a macro level, they are equally degraded. Just in terms of the flow of history, you can sit there and quibble and say that some of them are less bad than others, that they show different flavors of degradation.
I'm just looking for what the evidence is that they're more degraded, equally degraded, or lesser degraded, whichever way you want to cut it.
But they're degraded nonetheless. So what does it really matter? It's a matter of degrees.
It matters in the idea of form of force. Of you saying force is not a contributing factor towards masculine principles of achieving this ultimate goal of what masculinity is from your view. If that's the case, we should be able to look where men utilize force against women for the purpose of control and see that that's further away from these masculine principles and not closer. It really is that simple.
Except we don't really have a control group where we have a society where men are still in touch with that authentic masculine center and are using force that in the context of that.
Well, that's highly subjective as to what you consider that to be, one. And two, even if I granted that this is the case, we still have massive control groups of people who would be closer to this ideal or less close to this ideal. We have half of the planet to compare to the other half. And so it's like, even if that's the case, and I grant that we don't have the source thing, the perfect being in which to make the comparison of these societies to, what we can at least do is show which society is closer to that state of being that you consider the perfect masculine.
I don't really consider any society to be close to that. I mean, it's the Kali Yuga. Like, you're not, even back into antiquity, you would struggle to find an example of that.
And would you struggle to find people, those who are closer to it? Like I could say everyone's a thief, right, who steals, but some are worse thieves than others. I could say that about murderers too. There's a lot of murderers out there. Some are worse murderers than other murderers, right? I can make these comparisons, and you make these comparisons every single day about almost everything that you believe. You give it a scale, an up-down scale of how bad on this scale of horribleness you actually are. So do I think that a man who, for instance, who's a murderer in a crime of passion shoots somebody is as bad as a serial killer? I don't, and I'm sure you don't either, right? And why? Because we can make a gauge of how much further away one is from the ideal than the other. I'm literally just asking you for that same type of even intuitive evidence that we could point to here for which would be closer to this masculine principle of what you consider the perfect masculine. And you really have just spent about 40 minutes evading that question. And even though you say that they're on par with each other, you really haven't demonstrated any other evidence than because I think so. And that to me is not only unsatisfactory, but it really doesn't even help your case. So just saying.
Well, it might be unsatisfactory, but we're working within the limitations of the time we had. So
I understand.
I
remain
I can't prepare for every single point you might bring up. I'm not, and it's not frankly something I want to spend my time on doing, collecting data after data in the event you may bring something up. I'm happy to have a conversation. Some things we may have to just accept we don't have the data for at hand and then move on, because frankly, this is getting a little bit boring and tedious. But if your argument is that force is what leads men back to their spiritual center, feel free to make your case for it. I don't see it. How does force lead men back to their spiritual center?
Here's my case for the idea of force doctrine. My case is actually just to utilize your very worldview. That if it is the case that women decide to collectively do a stupid thing, how is it that men would stop them? I want to give you your exact answer. Force. And so it must be that one of these highest epitomes of masculinity is when women try to stray away from whatever this path is, that force be used to stop them from doing so. And I would even go one step further and say, also, this is the case with men. That if it is the case that men are straying away from this path of whatever the ultimate masculine is, that we would appeal to the same idea of force in order to bring them back into the fold. This is, I would look at all of the social constructed society that we have to demonstrate this. The idea of forms being there's the perfect form on this end and then the decayed form here. The reflection of all of human social interactions that I can see are based around the governance of laws and order. And that is part of that masculine that you're talking about. If that's the case, men use force themselves in order to govern other men, in order to move more towards these attributes. But somehow they're not supposed to do that with women. It's absurd. And even in your own kind of paltry example of what do you do when wild horses are running free, you give me an example of force in order to corral those fuckers up. It's
I've
like
never denied the use of force as
but
an
that's
option.
that's my whole point is like the big thing that's missing here that you're having a hard time reconciling is when you say on the one hand force is not a necessary conditional, but then every single time we dive into it we seem to recognize that it's the use of force which provides the conditionals for the perfect masculine to begin with.
I think we're confusing force with limits here.
How do you enforce limits?
With force, of course, but that doesn't make them equal.
What does that mean?
Which part? What does limits
mean,
or what does it mean that they're not equal?
So you're just saying that that you can impose limits absent force as long as everybody socially agrees with them. Great. I would never dispute that. That's just like trivially true. It would be trivially true if I said, this is the line that you're not allowed to cross, but I'm not going to use any force if you do. And you were like, well, I just choose not to cross it.
Well, it's kind of like having a chain on
true.
You and you don't recognize it until you try to go outside the limits of it.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It doesn't mean that you
but my whole point
to...
is like there would have to be some sort of agreement. You agree that you're not going to cross the line. But what prevents you from crossing the line ultimately is that if you do, you get fucked up, right? That's all of human social interactions that I can point to everywhere on planet Earth for all of history. Here's boundaries. How do we enforce these boundaries? Well, I kill you. That's how we enforce the boundaries. It's really that simple. Somehow that's divorced from your idea of the perfect masculine. And yet it seems to me it's completely entrenched in this perfect masculine for social interactions to even work.
It's not divorced from the idea of it. I've just put out a whole 2-hour documentary on the nature of the warrior, and they of course use force. So I'm not in. I don't think we're actually in disagreement here in the way that it seems like we are. I think maybe we're talking past each other to a degree.
I'm not sure we are.
Maybe not. But I'm not denying that force may be necessary or that it's even appropriate.
Yeah, but I'm arguing that force is a necessary conditional for there to be this idea of the masculine that you so want men to move towards. Necessary conditional, I think, and because I'd argue it's a necessary conditional for these things, when you make the contrary claim that force is unnecessary in order for men to get back this idea that women will follow them, because they're just, the form of whatever it is perfect, and they just are so attracted. Their panties drop the second they see it. They just can't get enough of these guys, right? They're the best. I would say that the intricate part of that is actually force, and that this very idea relies on men's force, all of it. And so I think that most people could actually take your objective view here, right? I know it's subjective, but it's objectively stated as though these are universal truths. And just say, well, then ultimately I can just reduce this to do what the fuck I say or else. And that'll lead us, at least in some capacity, back to a more masculine frame or a more masculine form.
How will that fix the spiritual crisis of men? How does using force orient men toward the transcendent?
Because it begins with
the question.
Yeah, because it begins with the idea of accountability, and men utilize force for the purpose of accountability. And so if force is used against men or women by men, it's usually to hold them accountable for something. Now, this isn't always the case, right? It's just socially the case. So men can use force for dominance, and they can use force to go control other nations or take their resources or whatever the fuck they want, right? But socially, it seems that men utilize force in order to uphold some type of like social norms, which can even exist so that there can be children and everything else to begin. They're completely interwoven. So when you kind of make this claim like, what happens when women misbehave? Well, it's because men aren't doing A, B, and C. It's like, well, can women even misbehave if men go don't or else? I'm not even sure they can. Like, I'm not even sure that's possible. Do we even care? Like, if it is the case, it's a superior ontology, right? Why do we even care if women are happy? Like, why should we even give a shit? If we can just lock them all up in our cages, right, and grape them whenever we want, why should we even give a fuck, ultimately? It doesn't even seem like there's anything there for us to care about. Who cares about their perfect forms? Totally relying on us. We're not in the perfect masculine. Lock those bitches up and use them as sex puppets. Like, I don't understand how that would be even contrary to the view.
This is why you get the rise of feminism as a response to that kind of attitude, as a protective mechanism against the tyranny of the phallic man.
And then what happens?
That's why I say force divorced from a transcendent orientation leads to a much deeper problem.
Interesting. So then you should be able to point out in the nations where they are highly oppressive, these men, that happening. And you can't. Which is why I've been asking for the demonstration over and over of you to do that and show that these nations are much more in decline or degraded.
How can I demonstrate that these men are oriented toward the transcendent? I can't point to that. I don't know what's in their hearts.
Okay, so, but you can at least know by the social dynamics that there's something wronger or less wrong than in the West, something like this, that would give you some attributes towards the perfect masculine that you have in your brain.
Their societies seem to be pretty dysfunctional, so that seems to speak for itself.
More dysfunctional than Western societies?
Dysfunctional in different ways.
Yeah, so not more again. So it's like, this is the problem, is like, when you make the bold claim out, so they're equally as bad, it's like, in the form of this masculine thing?
They're equally divorced from a transcendent orientation. That's what makes them equally as bad.
Then show me how.
How can I demonstrate their transcendent orientation when I can't
like
tell you what's
this?
in their heart?
I will explain to you how you can do it. Do you agree with me that the way that we would know what's in a person's heart is by the behaviors and the societies which they build? We would be able to make some judgments on the character of the people who live in those societies and build them, right?
Only to a degree.
I mean, what other metric can we even use?
Well, that's the thing. It's not really something that can be reduced to the empirical.
Well, it's not
you
reduced.
can use it. You can.
It's not reduced.
You
to the
can certainly
empirical.
use those empirical metrics to get some idea, but.
Well, what else would you even use other than the empirical to make your case? Like just
Well,
how you
by
feel?
what method are we judging it? Like material quality of life? Okay, the West wins that hands down, but they're spiritually dead.
No, we're judging it by what you consider.
Are we basing it on adherent? Are we basing it on adherence to a forced religion?
No, we wouldn't be basing it on either of those
that?
things. Here's how we would judge it. I'll actually give it to you in as easy a form as I can. Men abandoned their spiritual center. Man ceases to embody whatever that form is, whatever their form is, because women have strayed away from this spiritual, because men strayed away, then women strayed away, blah, 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 blah. Whatever man in this case is, the form he's supposed to embody, whatever that is in your mind, whatever that ends up being, right? Whatever socially the society is that these men are in is going to look a certain way, right? Right?
To a degree, I guess, sure.
Yeah, it's going to have to, right? It's going to have to. I mean, I don't even know how you would make a judgment about whether or not men are living up to these ideals or not, other than based on what you observe in the societies that they build. So if that's the case, and we're looking for whatever this perfect embodiment of male form is, and masculinity is inside of your brain, we would be looking at the metrics for the social dominance of society, or the social metrics of various societies, to look at the types of societies they build, and if they're closer to embodying whatever that form is than other societies, or we can never determine how we would even be on the right track. That's how.
Okay, can you point to a society that has a sacred king and a tripartite division of their social castes, and where initiation is a factor for the upper castes? That just doesn't exist anywhere anymore.
Why does it need to?
Because that was a key part of how men became masculine in this way.
So what?
In the traditional worldview, initiation was the way that you become a man.
So tribal. So we should look at tribal societies?
No, not necessarily.
Why? They have all of
same,
those things?
It's not the same type of initiation.
What? Yeah, I think. Well, what types of initiation are you talking about?
I'm talking about a solar regal initiation.
Which is what?
Usually used for kings, but also of the upper caste too, which involves an overcoming, a heroic overcoming that is designed to change one's ontological nature, elevating him. Like a man who was uninitiated,
like killing a fucking lion.
No, it usually involved going and lying in a coffin for a few days, meditating or something like that.
That sounds like killing a lion.
The specifics are vary from culture to culture, but
I mean, that literally sounds like if you go and kill a fucking lion and other people in the tribe don't have to go kill a lion, right? That would serve the same exact function as getting put in a coffin for 3 days.
No, so I mean, I'm being kind of tongue-in-cheek, but in a nutshell, what you would be looking at is somebody who, first of all, has already mastered their mind as a prerequisite to this. Like they're already able to sit in stillness and meditation as a bare prerequisite. It involves a number of ritualistic things that are meant to simulate the first death. Mm-hmm. So you die before you die, and then you're twice reborn. And this is what gives you caste, and this is what makes you a man. And any man who had not undergone his caste initiation was considered on the same level as children and animals and women.
Okay, got it.
So
and
without that,
we now have a metric.
We don't have that. We don't have any way to really judge
I mean,
individual
there's tribal
men may
societies
have a
which
transcendent
do
orientation, but I mean, it just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. So, but even by those metrics, let's just assume that there's not a single tribe on Earth which operates this way, which I would dispute. They would consider some, elder chief or whatever who was put in this position of authority over time, who can sit in stillness and meditate and all this bullshit. And then he goes out and he hunts down and he kills a lion. Now he's king, right? It's kind of following that same pathway. But let's just grant for a second there is no society which exists which is like that anywhere on planet Earth. I'm just willing to grant it. Fine. Who cares? We can still take a look at societies which are further astray from that than societies which are moving closer towards that. That's my point. So if you say these are equally displaced, neither are moving more towards that than the other, then that's when I'm asking for, okay, well, how would you demonstrate that? Because that's what your claim actually is. You could demonstrate it by mocking it against whatever this perception of the perfect society is, and then comparing these other ones and see which one's further away from whatever that metric is. It's that simple.
Okay, we're just going to have to agree to disagree on that point, because I think that when it comes to the use of force in that regard, if it isn't connected to that transcendent orientation and a genuine authority that's rooted in being, then it's just oppressive tyranny. It leads further down the wrong path. It will eventually give rise to a new version of feminism. I mean, it's not solving the spiritual problem. And that was really the crux of my argument at the beginning, is that this is a spiritual problem. How do we solve the spiritual problem? It's not by just beating up on women.
Didn't say it was, but in any case, the idea here, though, that feminism doesn't lead to the outcome of exactly this happening anyway, where they become, as a necessary entailment of feminist movements and the movement towards supremacy over men, they're going to end up having force doctrine used on them, whether they like it or not, which seems like that would be part of the cycle. And if I look back in history, I see this over and over and over again. So it seems like the societies which are in that part of the cycle of, nope, we're going to contain all this shit just like we do the horses, must be further along in this whole idea of your perception of the perfect man or the perfect form of man than societies without it. Just saying, because the necessary entailment of feminism, it leads to this sort of social domination by men as an outcome. Every single time I see where there's women who have higher social status than men, this is what their fate is.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly societies that are maybe further or less far along, but at their root, all of them have lost their transcendent connection. They've all lost that orienting axis that a sacred king would provide. They've lost the axis within the men themselves. And the flavors of degradation you get may be culturally specific, but the fact is that there is not a genuine patriarchy anymore. And I don't think that we probably will get one back, unfortunately. I don't personally believe that there's some way to reverse the decline. I think the only solution is for individual men to decide for themselves that they want to reassert this heroic center within themselves, to become that stable axis just within this sphere of their own lives, let everything fall into place around them. And I mean, from an individual level, that's all you can do, and that's all you need to do. From a societal level, things are going to continue to decline. And, you know, nobody can stop it. It's not really anybody's fault. We can only be responsible for our own choices as individuals.
Well, I would have to counter to that and just say this, that that's a very black-pilled position, which relies very heavily on esoteric philosophy in order to make the kind of just of the claim. Instead, I see the reverse. One thing people forget is that when societies are in decline, there's option 3. People think there's only 2, either society rebounds or society collapses, right? But that's not the case. There's option 3, which is Renaissance. Society greatly begins to manifest change, and quickly. And it may not look like it did before the Renaissance came. In fact, it never does. But it can actually, in many cases, encapsulate the very ideals that the previous society had that they were trying to get towards anyway. And I think it's awful blackpilling, and only a reliance on this philosophy was very narrow. And again, I think leads people to think that women have very little accountability in comparison to men, while at the same time taking force away from men is an option to enforce accountability against women, because you don't think that moves them any closer towards their masculine supremacy or whatever the hell it is.
I have not advocated for taking force away from men. I don't think it's possible to do that.
No, I didn't say that,
I just think men misuse it.
Yeah, I didn't say that you advocated for taking force away from men. Rather, what I said was that you don't see force itself as being a necessary conditional towards the movement towards this perfect, masculine, whatever that is. I'm disagreeing and saying I think it's a necessary conditional. And in fact, whatever this perfect masculine is, force is intricately part of its nature, because it's the very nature of man.
Let me clarify. So it's not that I don't think force is necessary. I fully concede that it may be necessary, but I draw a distinction between force that is used by men who are angry, resentful, and acting from a place of hurt and wanting to dominate and seek power, versus force that is used in a way that is grounded in wisdom, with stewardship over those who you are responsible for and who will be under you. And that is done with good discernment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are really...
It's kind of like, look, you know, like sometimes you have to use force. Sometimes you have to do something that's unpleasant. And that isn't that kind of what it is to be a man? You're the one that has to do the unpleasant things. It always falls to you as the man to have to do the unpleasant things. Oh, an animal's suffering, you're the one who has to go out and put it down. Stuff like that, right? And you need to be able to do that dispassionately and grounded in wisdom. And the only way you get that is with a transcendent orientation. And so men who want force just because they want to dominate, because they want to seek power, because they're acting from a place of hurt and resentment, that is not going to lead to a good outcome for anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is really interesting that you, as the embodiment of the feminine, who says that men have vacated what their very role for the perfect masculine is, tries at the one side of her mouth to take away the very tool which enforces the masculine against bad female behavior.
To take it away.
Yeah, but it's interesting because you say these things like if it's done in anger. Who cares if it's done in anger? Anger is part of men's ontology too. Who cares if it's done?
No, that's actually part of women's ontology.
No, it's part of men's too.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, they're not separate. Men and women both suffer from anger.
Yeah, because men are feminized. Like we all have elements of the masculine and feminine within us. We have to. But a man who's acting from anger is a man who's a feminized man.
Oh, got it.
He's a man who isn't dispassionate. He hasn't mastered himself. He doesn't have control over his emotions. He's reactive.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that you wanted a bunch of robots in the field of battle to
No,
give
not
into
robots at all.
to their anger passions when it came to fighting. That's one of the things that protects soldiers, for instance, and kings. And by the way, it does not a displacement. There's a time and a place for everything, including anger. And what's so funny is like this is a disconnection which happens with virtue ethicists all the time. When you're looking for whatever you consider the pure form to be, I include all of the emotions of men and women because there's a time and a place for all of those emotions. The distinction between you and I is that you say it's not even part of the ontology. It is. Not only is it, it's part of the makeup ontologically of what men and women are, these emotions. And the reason we know that there's a time and a place for them is because they can be used to great benefit for both sexes, depending on what's going on at the time. So no, I don't think that the idea of just the pure stoic, rational man is all that great, and never have. Do I think that it needs to be tempered with stoicism? Sure. Or some form of emotional control? Absolutely. But I'm not going to divorce that from the pure man, or whatever you consider the pure man to be, because that would be absurd. Anger is fine if it's used correctly. Same thing with many traits of the masculine and feminine. Anger can be used to great result. For instance, if a woman or a man sees a car which has collapsed on their children, it might make them very angry. It supercharges their strength. They start to push this car to the side. They may not be able to tap in those reserves without getting angry. How's that a bad social outcome? It's not. You cannot actually divorce these concepts. I don't think even in its purest form you could divorce the idea of emotions from what is man nor woman, but rather you would be looking at what the tempered version of them
I'm
is.
not talking about not having emotions. I'm talking about not being reactive to your emotions and not being controlled by them. You should still have them and fully feel them and just choose.
Then how come
like,
when I said men are angry, you said it's not part of their ontology?
Because that kind of anger and passion comes from the feminine side of the polarity. This is part of matter and flux. It's not part of...
Then you are divorcing emotion, at least some emotions, from the pure form of man, and I dispute that. I think that that's silly. If you divorce them from their ontology,
it is divorced from being. It is divorced from being.
Yeah, it's not divorced from being, though.
It is. I mean,
no, I don't even think that the
like
gurus...
fundamentally different worldviews here, and
Yeah.
I think you're grossly mischaracterizing a lot of my positions, either from ignorance, probably from ignorance. I don't think you're being malicious, but...
All right.
Before we get too deep down that rabbit hole, I'd like to go ahead and move into closing statements. And again, we can still continue being a little responsive to things during the super chats. I'm sure more information will come out, and I'm happy to accommodate that. But Andrew, would you like to go ahead with your closing statement, please?
Yeah, it's interesting. First I wanted to thank my opponent. We did find a lot of common ground on the first prompt. The second one, not at all. I could have, I guess, rejected many of these ideas because they're highly contestable, by the way. The idea of the pure form of anything, which comes from, a higher plane or its perfect existence and then is mapped on to the grounding of how we see things in reality. I understand a lot of audience gets lost by that, right? But this is Aristotelian, Platonic ideas, essentially. What I would just point out is this. I was willing, in fact, to do the opposite rather than contest the grounding worldviews or what I think the true Aristotelian view would be. I instead just opted to grant it. And the reason I wanted to grant it was to show that ultimately her very ideas of what the perfect masculine are don't even make sense because she divorces the very nature of what makes men from men. And the way she does this kind of clever bait and switch, but I caught it pretty quick. The idea here, and the reason that she's able to make the bold claim that men themselves are responsible for feminism, is because she marries female accountability to men acting in their perfect role. Those are married. So if it is the case that men are not acting in a way which is supporting this idea of the perfect man, women don't really have accountability here because they're only the way they are because men aren't doing the things that they're supposed to do. So she marries the idea of female accountability to the very idea of they can't be accountable if men aren't the ones who are sitting there acting like the perfect man or closer to the perfect man that she envisions or whatever. But what's really funny here is if we take this and we reverse it and we say, okay, well, what happens if we decide to hold women accountable in this essence of what is perfect masculinity, let's say with something like force? She can't deny that that can be effective. But what she says instead is like, if you're not doing it up to whatever this perfect form in her head is of what the masculine is, then you're doing it wrong. Now, we should be able to demonstrate that pretty easily, right? By showing where this is indeed happening and show how there's a distinction in the West for how they're less prone to hit this kind of form versus in the East. And if they're more or less likely to hit whatever this perfect form is based on the social structures that they have. 0 examples of that. 40 minutes, we went circular on that. This is a problem with when you make kind of these broader ontological claims, right? It's really interesting to have a contained worldview. When you seal it up and put it on paper, it all sounds great. It's when it becomes challenged that you start having these various issues, right? I was willing to grant the entire worldview. It's just really easy to destroy it with a single question. And the question is, what if men are embodying this? And women who I believe have will and their own accountability move against that. What is it that men have recourse with except force? She says, well, in that hypothetical, there wouldn't be any recourse except force. But here's the trick, Andrew. If men acted like that, women would never behave this way. Well, that's really fucking convenient, isn't it? It's really convenient to be like, well, you see, the thing is, Andrew, is that the reason force and force doctrine things are never necessary is because if men were playing out this perfect masculine role, right, women themselves would never need to be held accountable for anything. And on top of that, women themselves would basically just mold right in based on what it is that the men are doing. Awful convenient, then, to always be able to say that men are at fault for essentially everything. It would just be this. It wouldn't just be social sexual dynamics. Men would actually be at fault for literally everything, because without them being closer to this perfect form and women following in suit then because they just can't help themselves, the man closest to this form is a panty dropper. Women lose all form of will. They lose all form of accountability immediately. They just mold right into that, right? Interestingly enough, you can place the entire burden of all social ills then on men if you follow this ideal. And remember that what I was just trying to demonstrate, and I think I did pretty effectively, is that this is just a displacement of accountability under a convenience archetype, which says it's impossible for women to rebel against men by their very nature if men are acting the right way. That's the whole argument redo. I'm going to put it in really simple forms. Kat's actual argument here in very layman's terms It's impossible for women, based on their own will, to collectively rebel against men if men are acting right. No force necessary. Well, I reject that. I think that women have will and they have free will. And the thing is that within the confines of that will, they can make collectively really fucking stupid decisions, just like men can, including rebelling against the will of men who are much closer to this ideal than not. And that's the whole problem with the philosophy. I think it collapses instantly because we have to take that supposition into account, and she never could demonstrate it. So anyway, I appreciate the convo. I appreciate the debate. It was a lot of fun. And you were very good faith. You were very good faith. And for that, I thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and Philosophy Cat to you.
Thanks. Yes, I appreciated the conversation too. I'm sorry, both of us were a little tired for it. So first of all, my idea of the masculine, this isn't something I've just made up. It's derived from traditional belief systems that have consistency across history and geography. These are well-established doctrines. Maybe it doesn't quite fit into a Christian faith, which I know is, I think Andrew's Christian, but it's not something I just made up off the top of my head. And I think Andrew isn't well-versed enough in traditionalism to critique it. This isn't really the right format either to lay out the full comprehensive worldview, but I do have a full body of work on the subject for those who do want to learn about it. So just in closing, feminism, I think, is a sign that something has gone out of alignment. It's a symptom. And when the masculine principle is present, that stable, ordered, inwardly governed, self-sufficient principle, then the feminine has something to respond to. I don't rule out force, but the answer isn't just force alone. It's a return to form. And if men want a different world, they do need to become different men, not louder, not harsher, just more rooted in what the masculine actually is. And when form returns, then the matter will reorganize. And that's how this ends. That's how it's fixed. And I'd also just say, lastly, that I think the characterization that I said it's impossible for women based on their own will to collectively rebel against men if they're all acting right. That isn't what I said. And I do think that's a bit of a straw man. Obviously, women do have accountability for their actions on an individual level, but ontologically speaking, they are reflective, they are passive, and they will reflect what men give back to them. So, it's not really blaming men as such. It's not saying men are accountable and women are not. But if you do want power, like if you do want credit for building the civilization, you also have to take responsibility for when it cracks. So, yeah, not pointing the finger at men as such, but just saying, there is a solution out of this. There is a pathway out of it. This is what I see as the pathway, agree or disagree, whatever the case may be.
Perfect. Thank you, Kat. I appreciate it. The chat had a lot of fun with this. We had the taco doctrine, the horse doctrine, the wine doctrine, and thanks to Rachel, now we have the vodka doctrine. So we've been having a good old time enjoying the different things that were going back and forth between the two of you. So fair enough, it was entertaining, or at least for us it was. I'm going to roll through the super chats. If you want to respond, please feel free to speak up, quick, concise, to the point. Otherwise, if you're not saying anything, I will just continue moving on, okay? James S. with the Big 10 says, there is no in-between for S-tier grifters like Andrew. Victor says, the patriarchy can help you. I think that's a shot to you there, Miss Cat. Hall says, if I contributed 80% to the household for 5 years and she demanded I vacate, I am responsible to continue funding her choices that no longer include me. Any thoughts to that one?
I would say you're responsible for getting her back on her feet, not funding a lifestyle, but, make sure she can get a job, make sure she has somewhere to live, make sure she doesn't need to go fall into the arms of, some other man to support her. Let her move on. Try to make each other whole.
That's fair. And Mark sends in the Big 55 saying, hey, Sarah, sending love from the Crucible. Say hi to Andrew for me. Hi, Andrew. And Mark says, oh, I see the dog surgery goal now. Hope your dog gets better or gets the help she deserves. Thank you so kindly. Hall says, in 2 marriages, no kids, no infidelity on my part. How long should I pay the formally communal bills when I was pushed out of the marital home. Both filed for divorce before I was evicted.
I think we already answered his previous question on that.
I think that's fair.
I mean, I'm sorry that happened to him. That sounds really terrible, and I'm sure that was quite a disruption to his life. And hopefully whatever happened, they have both ended up back on their feet now.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Mark says, if you love dogs, donate to the Tomato Show. I like the debates you moderate, Sarah. Keep it up. Thank you again, Mark. Airborne says, if the man who has provided during the relationship has some continuing obligation to pay, what obligation does the woman have? Does she cook, clean, and provide sex to her previous husband? Or why not?
I think the goal there is to sort of move on and go your separate ways. So I think it's just about winding things down and, again, making sure you each land on your own 2 feet so that nobody's left in a bad situation. I like the obligation. I don't know, obligation. I don't really like that word. And you, like hopefully you just decide to do that out of the goodness of your heart because you just don't want to see somebody you cared about suffer. Like,
right. And you and Andrew already agree there was a conditional on that. So I think I think you didn't negate the common sense factor by any means. Mark says, all right, one last super chat to make the goal. Thank you again, Mark. And I think Hall is just carrying the show today. I said it on the Crucible side while Sarah was setting up a feminist standpoint, Christianity incoming. Fair enough. Airborne says, of course, everything is men's fault. Women have no agency and thus cannot be responsible. Insert cosmic crystal energy, woo-woo, to try to confuse you. The Bible lays out the role of men and women. Any thoughts?
Like, what do you even say to that? If somebody's going to just be dismissive like that, it's not really worth commenting on.
Fair. Hall says, another all men until no men argument. Fair enough. And Hall sending out the command to everyone watching the stream, like should be at least 90% of viewers. If you didn't hit the like, you are part of the problem. Yes, you are. Everybody hit the like button, no matter where you are watching from right now. Thank you. Speedy Lee says, the biggest failing that has led to feminism is mothers neglecting their duty to raise virtuous women. We shouldn't forget that women have agency.
You know, she actually brings up a good point. Is that a woman? I'm sorry, I can't really see, and I apologize if I've misgendered anybody. She brings up a good point about duty, and I think that is a huge part of the problem of the modern malaise, is that everybody is just pursuing what makes them happy, and nobody cares about duty anymore. And I've always said to people, like, if you're lacking purpose in life, think about what your duties are and to whom, and start performing them.
Same.
Fair enough. Yeah.
It's a point of argument I use with feminists often. But the thing is I don't believe there can be duties if there's no accountability. Like women in modernity, I think, by using your logic, would actually have no duties, because until men move back into whatever this role is, essentially women have an excuse to not act like women. They have they have no collective accountability. They can only mold into whatever the role is of whatever this perfect or archetype of man or something close to this archetype of man is. So what duties could they even have right now?
You know, I think that's an interesting question, because, you know, in ancient times, life was structured around every act of life was based in ritual, and that's where your duties derived from. Is like, what is your participation in all of these ritual acts that define every part of your day? We don't have that anymore. So what are your duties, right? Like, it just becomes a social construct. It becomes very hard to define, and then it becomes very easy to argue about, well, I shouldn't have to do this. It doesn't make me happy.
Well, so what are women's duties right now in modernity? What are their duties?
You know, I find it hard to say, like, what is a man or a woman's duty in general in modernity, because there's nothing to orient it to.
Well, you do have, like, you do tell me men's duties is that they should be moving towards whatever this archetype is.
I wouldn't characterize it as a duty. I think it would be good for that to happen, but I don't think somebody's obligated to do that. And short of a ritually based lifestyle, I find it very hard to find something concrete to pin duty to. But that said, that doesn't mean you don't have any. Like, for example, you have a duty to your family, right? You know, do you have a duty to take care of your parents when they get old? Do you have a duty to your children to raise them right? Do you have a duty to your spouse, to your employer, to your friends? Like, there are obligations that we could come up with. And I think, you know,
I'm not sure
if
that
somebody
we
were
could.
to put a little thought into it, they could come up with somebody they have a duty to.
I'm not sure that we could if the idea is that women can evade the idea of them acting in this way that they're supposed to act because men aren't acting in the way they're supposed to act. So wouldn't that necessarily just displace the idea of all female duties? They basically wouldn't have any, right? Unless men started acting right.
No, I wouldn't say that.
So what would be a duty that women have even if men aren't acting right?
Well, I mean, for example, I'm a woman. I have a duty to my parents to make sure they're looked after in their old age.
But didn't you say that your husband is this archetype in which you have? Your husband is the archetype or closer to this archetype of the perfect masculine?
I don't think he would describe himself as perfect.
Would you describe? Yeah, right.
So he's not perfect. We all have flaws, but he does a very good job of striving towards that.
So then, don't you only have those duties because he is fulfilling his? But absent him fulfilling his duties, what are your duties?
Even without him, I still have duties to other people. I have a duty to take care of you know, the animals that are dependent on me, the people that are dependent on me. You know, there are obligations, and I think where modernity goes off the rails is just to be like, well, I don't really have to do anything unless I feel like doing it. And
well,
part
why
of
would
being
those
a
duties
mature adult
exist,
is doing
though?
things.
If men have displaced women's very ontological nature, why would those duties still exist until men get back to their prime masculine? I mean, you're basically displacing women's duties completely, right? We can't even hold them accountable for that, really, because they're not. I mean, men aren't doing what they're supposed to do. So we've changed the very ontological nature of women, right, to even have duties.
I don't think it's the ontological nature of women that has changed to quite the same degree. It has definitely changed a bit, and certainly it has also degraded. But I'm not sure I agree with your characterization of that's necessary for there to be duties.
I mean, I don't know, where would they get the idea from duties from?
Aren't duties like come down traditionally from your parents? Like, and it's kind of
they can
like even in Japanese culture, yeah. But even in like Japanese culture, that's like they are very family oriented. You know,
that would be ritual.
Yeah,
it is originally derived from that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean,
the
even
cult
what
of the ancestors and.
Yeah, what she's talking about, even if you have father to son, grandfather to son, this type of thing, that's still ritualistic in its very nature.
Like in the modern era, I think the only thing you really pin duty to is a sense of personal integrity, and you either have it or you don't. Like there's no social structure that's going to force you to uphold your duty or even give you a scaffolding on which that duty has very much meaning. And so it's easy to see why people drift away from it.
Unless you're in a Muslim nation.
Maybe.
Fair enough.
Anyway, moving on.
Communitarian says, thank you, Sarah, for setting and moderating these debates. My grift tithes go to you this week. Thank you so kindly. Happy to do it. Airborne says, men can stop bad women behavior with shame and social consequence, which is why women hate and fight against it. They want to unalive their children and to be celebrated for it. Total immorality. Ugh. Hall says, by her logic, women require the rod of unyielding toxic masculinity to come back to balance within their feminine. Help me out here.
By women require the rod of unyielding toxic masculinity to come back in balance with their feminine. Okay, I don't agree with his characterization of toxic masculinity because I think, again, that's going too much in the direction of phallic man rather than heroic man, and that's the wrong direction. But I do think that being around somebody who is themselves balanced and integrated can certainly help you do the same. I mean, it can definitely have a flow-on effect. Maybe I'm misunderstanding his question here, but
basically he's saying we require what we consider the toxic masculinity role in order to balance us back. Like, and that's what
like toxic in the sense of like the air quotes, like the way like a feminist thinks masculinity, like the patriarchy is toxic. Yeah, I would agree with him on that.
I have just one quick question I'd like you to answer if you don't mind. Can you think of anything which would be a social indicator of a less, I guess, of a society which is more dysfunctional than a society which cannot even reproduce its people?
No, I probably couldn't think of something more dysfunctional than that. I mean, that's...
And do you agree that the more religious societies, which are more totalitarian, tend to actually reproduce their populations in comparison to those who aren't?
Well, yes. And look, I would say this about religion. I think most modern religions today block access to the higher, but they also guard against the lower. And I think that they can be a bulwark against further degradation. They can certainly slow it down. They can certainly help keep people on the straight and narrow. And so for that reason, I'm generally in favor of religion. I mean, I'm not an atheist or anything, but I generally would encourage people to find a religion if they can find one that suits them for that very reason.
Fair enough. Hall says she's claiming that there's a spiritual entropy that will naturally happen to men, but it's the fault of collective masculinity that feminism is so out of control. Well,
this guy has a lot to say.
Yes, that's why I said he's kind of like the contributor of the day, I think.
Well, that's nice that you have an engaged audience like that. Yeah, so it's not like, I just really have to clarify, like, it's not the fault. It's a natural process that happens. This I know Andrew kind of characterized this as being black pill. I don't see it as a black pill thing. I see that entropy as, in a way, it's a gift. It's an opportunity for a greater overcoming. Like, is it a greater heroic task to overcome in the golden age when everything's easy, or when everything's really hard and the odds are completely stacked against you? So I don't want to say like, oh, this isn't men's fault. Like, every man alive today, just like every woman, has been propagandized since birth. The only thing is, you are just responsible for your own choices in life, your choice to choose whether or not you want to rise above the ruins of the modern age, or if you want to be swept away by it.
But it is naturally men's fault.
I think we have to put nuance on that word fault, though, because when you say fault, like, I don't want people to feel like they are being blamed for something that they had no control over, for a world that they were born into.
Well, some men had control over it when they did have control, and it was their fault, right? And that was natural. It was naturally that group of men's fault.
I mean, everything can be traced to a prior cause, and you can trace that all the way back to the initial fall in the golden age, which I see as a sacrifice in order for there to be this life, so that we could have this opportunity to overcome and return back to source.
So, but it is naturally men's fault that this happened, right? Naturally, it is their fault. At some point, naturally, the very nature of men leads us to the belief that naturally this is men's fault and is not naturally women's.
It is not their fault for having been born into it. It is their responsibility to choose whether or not they want to overcome it or not, however. And if they choose that they do not want to overcome it because it's much more fun to be swept away in the sensory indulgences of the modern age, then that's a choice they make, and that is something they can be held accountable for. And I'm not saying that that's exclusive to men. Women also need to be accountable for their choices too. So I'm not saying anything like, oh, well, women who go out and abort their babies, that's men's fault. They can't be held accountable for that. No, they very much can and should be held accountable for that.
Fair enough. Airborne says women's expectations of men today are absolutely wild. She expects men to literally fight entropy, the natural decay of the universe. Talk about an impossible woo-woo, I'm guessing slut test? That's my...
Yes, I do have high expectations.
Shit test.
Test. I'm like, what?
No, nobody was saying that about you. That was a mischaracterization. He was saying shit test.
I don't know.
We'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
Shit.
Well, I mean, wouldn't that make a lot more sense than slut test?
Well, because the last one that was had the hyphens was sex, and so my brain just went immediately there. Thank you.
Somebody has their mind in the gutter.
I always do. Hall says, so the final
It's the modern
responsibility,
age.
is for men to make the world, I take the L on that, world less comfortable so women can come back to balance and survive. Force doctrine. Whew. Force doctrine, horse doctrine, taco doctrine, wine doctrine, and vodka doctrine. El Piro, let's take modern society. Many European countries do not allow certain additives and dyes in their food on the macro level. Not good, just like chocolate on the individual level. Fair enough. Hall says, so men need to completely remove themselves from feminine society until women acknowledge that feminism is poisonous. Ooh, that's a good, interesting thought.
Honestly, I do support men going MGTOW in the sense that they actually go their own way for a time. Like, I think that would be very good for young men to do. Like, don't think about women. Don't worry about women. Just focus on building yourself up internally in your early years. Like, you shouldn't be obsessing over like, oh, how can I get laid?
Well, then there wouldn't be any more women if men disconnected themselves from them, right?
I'm only talking temporarily, just
not
like
even
the
for
focus
6
of
months.
like young.
Not even like if men checked out for 6 months, women are decimated,
All men?
right? Yeah.
At the same time?
Yeah.
I mean, my husband hasn't even been gone for a week and I'm already just kind of like falling to pieces around here. As you guys saw when I couldn't find my mic cable.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about that would end all infrastructure.
Like
that would end all everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what I would do without them. So guys, don't take off for too long. We do need you.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be like the 4YB, 4 something? Like the women did it, and I think the men tried to do it in return as well, and it didn't work out so well. So I don't know. Hall says the impulse control and lack of accountability is the reason they would need support post-separation. Fair enough. Wild, wild horses. I had that song running through my head this entire debate. Thank you. She literally asked for extremely strict patriarchy. That's fair.
Yeah.
Miss Rachel Wilson says, Andrew understands perfectly. He just blew apart your worldview. You can't cope with this, so you have to believe he's misunderstanding. Have some humility and consider you might have constructed an overly complex pile of, I know this one, BS bullshit.
Yeah, she can think that if she wants to, but traditionalism is something I've been working with. I have a whole body of work on it going back, like 8-9 years or something like that at this point. It's definitely not something that can be distilled into a single conversation. So I don't know about you, Andrew. Do you have a background in having studied this ever before, or was this new to you today?
No, I'm not as in depth as you, of course, not even close, but I do understand a bit about the big T traditionalism versus the small T traditionalism, though I think that a lot of that's seated in virtue ethics and not as much in the shamanic stuff that you're talking about. But, to be totally fair, sure, you're far more well-versed in that, just like I would be probably far more well-versed in, let's say, guns. The thing is, though, interestingly enough, is that no matter how well-versed I am in the function of guns and how they work and how they operate, it wouldn't mean that you couldn't make a compelling argument about any supposition of my worldview, which was completely flawed, thus kicking out the pillar underneath, which holds up all of these other worldviews. So worldviews have pillars. They're based on some suppositions, and if those suppositions get destroyed, the rest of it, no matter how well and integrated you know it, no longer matters. All of the various details you may have studied in depth about how the color purple works may be extremely good unless I attack a supposition that you can't actually see purple, and so the rest of all of your study of purple now no longer means anything. It's not really that important, right? I'm just saying hypothetically, of course. And this is the case here. It doesn't matter if I've studied traditionalism as in depth as you. It's completely beside the point. Distillation of an argument is going to come down to a pillar, and yours, I don't think, was a very good one and was pretty easy to refute. But that's completely up to you, the person who takes it away. A lot of people don't like wasting 8, 9, 10 years of their life on a specific topic and ever yield off of it. So I understand that too.
Okay, well, I still maintain that you didn't fully understand, but that remains to be seen. Maybe you'll look into it more in depth, and we'll have another conversation at some point or something.
Fair
Anyway,
enough.
carry on, Sarah.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Hall says, so men need to fix us, but make us want to live feminine virtue without making anyone cry or the men fail due to natural entropy of the masculine. Fair enough. And he follows up again to say, how many more ways can we express that it's a universal entropy of masculinity that causes feminism, but men must stand up and restore masculinity without hurting women's feelings? Rattle.
I didn't say they had to do it without hurting women's feelings. That may be necessary.
You were agreeable to.
I mean, I fully expect that it would upset a lot of women. I mean, you know.
I mean, we cry at anything, so it works. Hall says, Raging Tomato, I believe that Tesseract wants to challenge Rachel. Challenge accepted. Someone said Rachel a margarita first. The Based In says, if women are reflections, they have no internal axis, no moral engine. That means a woman cannot be good in herself. She can only look like goodness when near a good man. That's not virtue.
Which basically
would agree with that.
That would basically instill that women are ontologically evil.
Yes,
the people have made that characterization. Yeah, I mean, you could make that argument.
Yeah. Look, I'm all for it. Devil. Justin says, grant all her positions. Ask, can you please demonstrate a past society that has gone through this cycle? Then ask, how do we get back to this state naturally?
A past society that has gone through all of the cycle and how to get back to it naturally. Like the way to get back to it naturally, you have to let the cycle exhaust itself. And the only way that it will then reinvigorate into a new golden age, at least according to my metaphysics here, is for there to be some men who actually achieve that heroic overcoming through an ascetic path.
Which society did that?
There has not been a society to do that because we are not at the end of the Kali Yuga yet.
Then how can you say it's cyclical?
That is the doctrine that all of these wisdom traditions have taught. So, I mean, can I empirically prove it? No, I mean, nobody can, but that's what all of these spiritual teachings pin themselves on. So,
Yeah, I see.
Got to start somewhere.
That's fair. I'm going to move a little faster through these if you don't mind. I'm a Hunter says, it's only a handful of times where I hear women say so much and so little all at once. This is another. Anyone keeping track on whatever God's green earth she is even saying? I thought it was an interesting conversation. Hall said, agree to disagree because she refuses to acknowledge her worldview is inconsistent. Man, Hall, you really had a lot to say on this one. Lansing says her argument sounds like a lot like the servant leader model. Lead me in the way I want to be led. Fair. The Based In, that's a trap a man must ask, but only in a way that she arbitrarily defines as correct after the fact. That's not order. That's post hoc moral blackmail.
It just eliminates accountability. I mean, the whole view essentially shifts all accountability onto men for not reaching their perfect form or something close to it. And due to the lack of them doing that, women are going to fall into complete disorder because they essentially have no accountability, like blank slates in a way. They can only just kind of reflect what men are, and that's it. It's like, well, okay, sense, yeah. I guess if that's the case, then all you've done, it's a very convenient way. I would say that most feminists would likely agree with you over me, that they would love to have a world in which all accountability was always shifted away from men because it can always make up new criteria for what the perfect man is. And so if you can just consistently make up the view of whatever you consider the perfect man to ontologically be, can't you just for the rest of time duck accountability because men never achieve whatever that is?
Well, fortunately, I didn't make it up. I've grounded it in the repetition of the same theme across multiple spiritual traditions over the ages. So, as I said, I do not claim ownership over these ideas.
I'm not saying you're making it up. I'm saying, couldn't women just consistently using the same view, just consistently make up a new archetype for what
if,
the masculine is in order to all consistently for the rest of all time displace their own accountability in all action.
Well, they could do that, but what are they grounding it in other than just as the, like, I mean, I'm deriving mine from something that's grounded in various traditions that
well,
this
I mean,
is a
you're
universal
just, but that's just an authoritative appeal. It's fallacious on its face to say I'm grounding things inside of some historic tradition. That doesn't make it true or false.
It's not a historic tradition. It's grounded in a metaphysical reality which has been expounded by these various spiritual traditions in different forms, but still ultimately point to the same root.
Well, making the claim that it's a metaphysical reality is going to take a lot more doing than just stating it. And the idea is like various traditions state this, and therefore it's true, is also still fallaciously appealing to these traditions for what these metaphysical realities are. The problem here, again, is we just endlessly point out that any woman can make a claim there's a metaphysical reality to what a man is. And this is what I believe the metaphysical reality is, which is reflected in reality, and they never achieve whatever that ultimate goal of that is, and so can endlessly say we're not accountable for our own actions because you're still not acting the right way.
I mean, I guess she could make that up, but you would need a kind of a complete system of metaphysics to ground that in, and I don't think most of them are doing that. So, you know, you got to start somewhere. And I think
feminists have systems of metaphysics, of course.
I don't know if it would pass my bar for it, but anyway, moving on, Sarah. Sorry to derail you again.
That's okay. This is a great conversation. I'm happy to oblige. And I am just going to skip to the 20s now, only because we are on a time crunch to keep the next show rolling. Eric Perez says the big 20 men take a risk of loss of investment if embarking in a traditional framed relationship. He loses this investment if the relationship ends. Equally, women take the risk that she may have to then go back to supporting herself. A grid one, an unreasonable man, says, did she really just say it's a man's duty to help a woman who leaves him back on her feet? I am patriarchy, and it seems you know little of my work. Get the rocks. Oh, Lord.
I think a woman should also help a man if the situations are reversed, by the way.
I'm agreeable to that. I think, you know, there's a support system built in, and women were meant to support. A grid also says, maybe I missed it. Does she believe women are to submit to their husbands? If a man wants to live in, what is that, austere, frugal life, and the woman wants extravagant lifestyle, is it not her duty to follow his lead? I think you were agreeable to that. Yeah,
I would agree with that. I have a whole video on my channel about women's submission.
Yep. Yeah. I was gonna say there were a lot of common denominators for the both of you, which is good because it allowed the conversation to dive into other pieces directly. Last two, Patricio says modern society, better technology, science, medicine, health, education, food access, housing, travel, etc. Women, life easier, so don't need men. Paradox?
I need my men. I like them around. Not ashamed to say it.
I am highly dependable on men. Justin with the big 20. Stick a fork in it. It's done. Acknowledge this never happened before. A core pillar of the worldview gone. Oh, and that would be the end of that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to raid you back over to Andrew's, and you can hang there until we kick off the next round. Everybody say,
when is that, by the way?
Like it's supposed to be 3 minutes, but I'm going to push it a little bit. I have to go let my dogs out.
I don't know. Should we just skip the panel section and then I'll take a break, take a nap so I can get ready for this debate?
I mean, I can hang out with the panel while you do something else.
Yeah, maybe.
But they were all here for you.
Yeah, maybe it'd be better. Well, okay. You know what? Fuck it. We'll just iron. We're just gonna tough this out.
This I'll push to 7:30. That should give you a little. You can get up, walk around, get some coffee, splash your face with some water. How's that sound?
All right, sounds good.
I feel bad for you guys. I was like starting to doze off after like an hour. I was getting so tired, and you guys are doing this whole marathon thing.
Listen,
how do you do this?
He said, "I want a party, Sarah, a big party," and I said, "Okay."
Well, 200,000. You deserve a party, Andrew.
True.
Yep. All right, ladies and
Appreciate
gentlemen, I bid you adieu. We'll be right back shortly. Goodbye.
Captain's log, June 2nd, 2836. After 27 years of war between the Degen Coomers and the Sainthood Slayers, a new hope arises. As the battlefield lay weaponized, locked and loaded for destruction, negotiations for a peace treaty are in transition. The moderator has arrived at Station 42. Can this war be ended? Will the Coomers and Slayers find a middle ground?
Abort mission. I repeat, abort mission. Negotiation failure. Abort mission.
Heavy boobies, 6+, low orbit, over grid 15-2.
No joy, Yashaman.
Then go to your window and look up their biggest fracking asteroid.
Copy, Yashaman. Still blind. Got some kind of system-wide crash in the defense grid.
Go on, track yourself right goddamn now, because we got Boku inbound, and they're not carrying flow.
Wait one, Yashaman.
We don't have one.